All right, buckle up. We're making this epic. We'll expand on some of the existing points, add a few new humorous angles, and weave in more descriptive, engaging language. The goal is more funny, more detailed, and still packed with those unexpected Viking truths. Here's a significantly longer, funnier, and more elaborate version of the script. Gather round, ya heathens and history buffs. Tonight, we're not just dipping our toes, we're diving headfirst into something arguably just as complex as philosophy, but with significantly more fur, fewer personal boundaries, and the occasional suspicious goat. Yes, we're talking Viking sex. It was politics, it was power, it was surprisingly poetic, and occasionally it was very public. So, before you get comfortably nestled on your modern-day longhouse bench, do me a solid, hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy my weird ramblings. And seriously, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's truly wild to see who's joining this chaotic longhouse party from across the globe, from the frosty fjords of Norway to the sweltering plains of, well, wherever you are right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft, distant hum of, well, distant mead-fueled revelry. Perhaps light a historically inaccurate candle for ambience. Let's ease into tonight's journey together, because what's better than an evening spent contemplating the intimate lives of people who used to raid your ancestors? Exactly. Vikings, scrubbing up and smelling, comparatively less terrible. Let's get this out of the way, right at the top, because it's a game changer for your mental image of a Viking. They were cleaner than your wildest, most soap-starved medieval dreams. Not spa day with cucumber slices and a gentle jazz flute soundtrack. Clean, mind you. But by the notoriously grungy standards of the European Dark Ages, they were practically soap-scented angels wafting through a continent that largely considered bathing a questionable sin or, at best, an inconvenient chore. While much of Europe was busy pretending that personal hygiene was an express ticket to eternal damnation, or just really inconvenient when you had a plague to contend with, the Norse were over there, surprisingly diligently, scrubbing themselves weekly. Weekly, let that sink in. Your average Viking was probably showering more often than a medieval French king. They used actual soap, a delightful concoction made from animal fat and ash. It probably smelled earthy, perhaps a bit like a damp bonfire that had a mild existential crisis, but compared to their unwashed, aroma-challenged neighbours, they were a walking, talking cloud of lavender and, let's be honest, smugness. And it wasn't just a quick splash. These were people who cared about their presentation. They combed their hair meticulously. They trimmed their beards with a surprising degree of artistry. They even filed their nails. Forget a fancy watch. The ultimate status symbol was a gleaming, unchipped fingernail. They even carried bone and iron grooming kits. Imagine, if you will, pulling up to a longhouse date, not just with a carved comb, neat braids, and surprisingly fresh breath, but with a full toolkit to maintain that pristine appearance in an era where most people still had hay, various insects, and existential dread in their armpits. The competition for looking good was, frankly, abysmal. The sheer audacity of their cleanliness didn't go unnoticed. English monks, bless their eternally bitter souls, actually observed this disturbing hygiene trend and recorded it with a level of bewildered indignation that still makes me chuckle. There's one infamous complaint from an Anglo-Saxon chronicler who basically whined that Viking men were too clean and thus unfairly attractive to local women. That's right. Their official, monastic explanation for Viking success with the ladies, besides, the raiding and the intimidating axes, was soap-based cheating, the sheer outrage. They come here, they pillage, and then they have the audacity to smell good. It's simply not fair. And honestly, the monks weren't wrong. In a world that collectively smelled like a forgotten compost bin on a humid summer's day, the guy who bathed once a week knew how to braid his hair into intricate patterns, and probably didn't have last week's dinner stuck in his beard, was by default practically a sex god. He didn't just stand out, he radiated cleanliness. But this wasn't just about vanity, although a little preening certainly helped. In Viking society, personal hygiene had status. If you were a free man, a respected member of the community, you were expected to look like one. And that meant grooming. if you were unkempt, if you looked like you'd just rolled out of a mud pit after a particularly rough Tuesday, people wouldn't just assume you were lazy. Oh no, they assumed you were poor, enslaved, or worse, a truly shiftless layabout who couldn't even be bothered to comb out a single lice egg for his long-suffering woman. The social pressure was real, and it smelled faintly of lye and birch sap. Cleanliness also carried ritual significance. Before feasts, before going into battle, before embarking on any significant adventure, including, you guessed it, bedroom escapades, you washed. It wasn't just about removing dirt, it was about preparing yourself. You were preparing yourself to be presentable to the gods, to your revered ancestors, or perhaps, most terrifyingly, to your extremely discerning Longhouse crush who was probably judging your ear hygiene from across the smoky hall. Viking romance, more poetry, fewer brutal abductions, usually. If your mental image of Viking romance involves nothing but grunting, dragging someone into a longhouse by their braids, and the occasional strategic clubbing, then prepare for a rather elegant surprise. These weren't just bloodthirsty raiders who communicated solely through guttural roars. They were also deeply sensitive, metaphor-loving weirdos who expressed love through an astonishing amount of poetry and, occasionally, just the mildest, most poetic of threats. Welcome to the world of skaldic poetry. This wasn't your grandma's rhyming couplets about flowers. This was a type of verse so dense with complex metaphors, so rich with kennings, those fantastic two-word riddles for common nouns like whale road for the sea, that it makes Shakespeare look like a hastily scribbled grocery list. And yes, they absolutely unironically used it to flirt. A Viking man truly smitten might compare a woman's hair to sunlit flax shimmering in the morning light, her graceful walk to a swan gliding effortlessly on the turbulent sea, or, if things were really heating up and he was feeling particularly bold, her body to a well-tempered sword. Now that's not your standard pickup line, is it? Hey baby, are you a finely crafted blade? Because I feel a keen edge when I'm near you. No, that, my friends, is cultural seduction. If your flirtatious poem didn't come with at least 3 obscure nature references, a nod to a forgotten battle, and a kenning that required a scholar to decipher, you were, quite frankly, doing it wrong. Your chances of securing that coveted longhouse date were slim. But don't be fooled by the flowery language. It wasn't all flowers and fjords and romantic strolls to the slaughterhouse. These poems could get graphic. And here's where things get legally fascinating. If a man composed a poem about a woman without her consent, especially one that implied a sexual liaison, or made her out to be less than honourable, that was considered dangerous. In some extreme cases, it was illegal. There's an actual law in the medieval Icelandic Gragas Code that specifically banned men from writing a nid, which translates to defamatory, insulting, or obscene poetry. If a man implied a woman had been sexually available when she hadn't, or spread unflattering poetic rumours that could result in exile or even death. So yes, in Viking society, composing a particularly spicy limerick about someone's daughter could literally lead to legal consequences, a public shaming, and possibly a duel at dawn. Choose your rhymes wisely, my poetic raiders. And women, by the way, were not just passive recipients of this flowery, legally dubious verse. Oh no. They were fully capable of composing biting verse in return. If a man's poetic overture was lame, crude, or just plain lazy, she might humiliate him publicly with a retort so devastatingly scathing that entire families would avoid eye contact at feasts for generations. We're talking next-level social annihilation. In one particularly legendary saga, a woman rebukes a man's advance with such poetic finesse, such lyrical put-downs, that he leaves the feast utterly humiliated and proceeds to join a monastery. That's right, she flirted so hard in reverse, she accidentally made him find God. Forget your modern dating apps, the real power move was poetic evisceration. So, while Vikings indeed carried imposing swords and formidable axes, the true, deeply unsettling weapon in matters of the heart was poetry. It was loaded with metaphors, laced with bragging rights, and legally actionable if you got too confident or too crude. A man's reputation, and indeed his life, could literally hang on the strength of his poetic meter. The fine print of love, marriage, consent, and counting goats. Let's not kid ourselves. Viking romance wasn't exactly built on a bed of rose petals, the soft glow of candlelight, and whispered sweet nothings. It was far more practical, often starting with a negotiation that sounded less like a heartfelt proposal and more like a livestock transaction. Your father has 3 excellent milk goats. I have a strong back, a respectable homestead, and I haven't gotten anyone pregnant outside of wedlock. Yet. Let's make a legally binding agreement. Consent existed, yes, but it had to elbow its way through a dense crowd of dowries, strategic alliances, and a formidable gauntlet of extended family members who all had very, very strong opinions on your life choices. Here's how the average Viking marriage proposal usually worked. A man decided he wanted to marry. He didn't go serenading his beloved under the stars, strumming a lute and composing a spontaneous skaldic ode. No, he would typically send his dad or his most diplomatic uncle, or perhaps his most verbally agile friend, to the girl's father to negotiate a deal. Because nothing screams undying passion quite like your potential future being discussed over generous tankards of mead and a meticulous valuation of sheep and land. It was a business merger with slightly higher stakes and the occasional feasting. And the woman in question, she technically had a say. A freeborn woman could refuse a match. However, whether that refusal was actually honoured depended entirely on a rather crucial trifecta: how much her family needed additional land, how desperate they were for powerful allies, or how eager they were to offload an opinionated daughter who was perhaps a little too good at poetic retorts. Some sagas suggest a strong-willed woman could indeed turn down a suitor and live to tell the tale. Others subtly imply she'd better run very fast if she tried, especially if the suitor came with a particularly large and angry uncle. Still, let's not paint them as entirely barbaric. The Vikings had some surprising progressive elements. A woman who was forcibly married, for instance, had legal recourse. She could stand before witnesses and declare herself divorced. No archaic paperwork, no labyrinthine court proceedings, no need for a ceremonial raven to deliver the news. Just 3 public announcements, preferably at the main door of the longhouse, or even at the marital bed itself. Talk about awkward. Basically, it was the medieval Norse version of "It's not me, it's you," shouted dramatically at a bustling dinner party, complete with stunned silence and spilled mead. And while the idea of abducting a bride might sound ridiculously romantic in some badly translated sagas or low-budget historical dramas, Viking law generally frowned upon it. Frown, not necessarily stop, mind you. Kidnapping a woman for marriage was illegal, but it was also confusingly occasionally celebrated in epic poetry. Nothing says mixed messaging quite like a legal code and a popular love ballad, giving you diametrically opposite advice on how to acquire a spouse. It's the Viking equivalent of being told not to speed, but then your favourite song is about a daring car chase. Then there were concubines, or, as Viking law charmingly, if somewhat chillingly, referred to them, bed thralls. These were women, often enslaved through various means, who were expected to provide companionship, cooking, and yes, sex. Consent in this particular arrangement? Mostly decorative, a fleeting afterthought. On a slightly brighter note, if a husband wasn't up to the job, emotionally, physically, or just generally, the wife had options. Viking women didn't have to suffer in silence, they could suffer loudly, in public, and often with surprisingly robust legal backup. The longhouse was a stage for drama, and marital disputes were often the main act. Premarital flex. No chastity belts here, just good sense. When it came to premarital relationships, the Vikings were, let's just say, refreshingly flexible. Unlike their medieval Christian neighbours who were busy obsessing over elaborate chastity belts, compiling terrifying purity odes, and constructing towering moral fences around female virtue, the Norse took a decidedly more relaxed, practical view. In fact, a woman's past experience wasn't necessarily a deal-breaker, unless it involved, say, someone else's husband, a very public scandal involving the neighbour's prize boar, or perhaps a particularly embarrassing public brawl. Being romantically involved before marriage wasn't some dark, whispered taboo. It was, quite simply, life. Vikings were practical people, and their society mirrored that pragmatism. If 2 consenting adults had a relationship, the world didn't spontaneously combust. Families might raise an eyebrow, or, if the timing was truly suspicious, both eyebrows, perhaps even a third if they had one. but they certainly wouldn't lock their daughters in towers, invent absurd chastity gadgets, or start frantic witch hunts. Here's the kicker: virginity was never, ever treated as a woman's sole or primary value. It simply wasn't the currency of worth. Women were respected for their skills, whether that was managing a complex household, trading goods, weaving magnificent tapestries, or even wielding a sword. They were respected for their family standing, their intelligence, and yes, their reputation. But that reputation didn't hinge entirely on what they had or hadn't done in the bedroom before tying the knot. In fact, some sagas even praise bold women who went after what, or who they wanted, especially if they did it with confidence, strategic cunning, and, ideally, a strong sword arm to back up their desires. This wasn't just cultural flexibility, it was outright survival logic. Viking society needed strong, capable partnerships. A woman who could efficiently manage a bustling farm, shrewdly handle trade negotiations, raise formidable children, and hold her own in a legal dispute was far, far more valuable than one with a perfectly untouched romantic history. Life was relentlessly hard, the winters were impossibly long, and practicality almost without exception won the day. Who cared if she'd had a dalliance or two if she could keep the livestock alive through a blizzard? That said, discretion was still encouraged. While premarital relationships weren't punished, boasting about them could absolutely get you into a world of trouble. If a man publicly bragged about a past partner and she hadn't consented to the story being told, especially if it painted her in a poor light, he could face legal consequences, including fines or social ostracism. Essentially, kiss and tell was considered both incredibly rude and, in some cases, surprisingly illegal. In short, the Vikings respected personal agency, as long as it didn't cause unnecessary drama at the feast or disrupt the delicate balance of community honor. Good manners were still important, even amongst the raiders, the gods, cosmic HR nightmares, and divine gender bending. If you thought modern mythology gets weird with its celebrity scandals and reality TV drama, just wait until you meet the Norse pantheon. This wasn't just a collection of powerful beings, it was a divine soap opera where shape-shifting, cross-dressing, dramatic romantic entanglements, and frankly bizarre acts of procreation were just a typical Tuesday. It makes Mount Olympus look like a quiet reading club. Let's start with Frey, the god of fertility. Now, Frey wasn't subtle. He was frequently depicted with, shall we say, an overwhelming enthusiasm for his role. His sacred statue reportedly came with anatomically confident features, almost as if it was designed by someone who really, really wanted to make a point about abundance. And his worship involved rituals that enthusiastically celebrated life, love, and very, very suggestive crops. If you were hoping for a god of modesty, restraint, or even basic subtlety, Frey was emphatically not your man. He was the divine equivalent of a neon sign flashing fertility this way. Then there's Loki, everyone's favorite chaos agent. He's the divine embodiment of hold my mead. In one truly legendary story, Loki, in an act of pure, unadulterated mischief, or perhaps strategic thinking depending on your perspective, transforms into a mare, yes, a female horse, to distract a magical stallion named Svadilfari. And it works so incredibly well, in fact, that Loki becomes pregnant and later gives birth to an 8-legged horse named Sleipnir, who later becomes Odin's primary mode of transportation. Somehow, this astonishing feat of interspecies, gender-bending, divine parenthood is treated as a quirky anecdote rather than a full-blown cosmic HR incident. Oh, Loki? Yeah, he's the one who gave birth to an 8-legged horse. Don't ask. And let's not forget Thor, the mighty thunder god. In another famous tale, he actually cross-dresses to infiltrate a wedding feast and recover his stolen hammer, Mjolnir. His disguise? A full bridal gown, complete with a veil and all the accoutrements. His brilliant plan? Grunt a lot, eat an astonishing amount of food, and hope no one notices the bride's rather impressive beard and gargantuan appetite. Spoiler alert, they notice. But the hammer is recovered and everyone goes home slightly confused, questioning their life choices and whether they should perhaps invest in better disguises for their gods. Why does any of this matter for our discussion of Viking intimacy? Because the Vikings, fascinatingly, didn't view romance, gender, or even intimacy as neat, tidy, or easily categorizable boxes. Their myths were messy, fluid, gloriously inappropriate by modern Sunday school standards, and often hilariously absurd. In fact, many Norse deities and heroes engaged in relationships and transformations that modern cultures would spend entire legal seminars, psychological evaluations, and moral debates trying to explain. The line between sincere affection and utter absurdity was incredibly thin, and the gods crossed it regularly, usually on horseback, or perhaps while shapeshifted into a salmon. But here's the unexpected twist. These myths weren't seen as shocking or scandalous by the Vikings themselves. They were just normal. Fertility, love, trickery, creation, destruction, these were all powerful, inherent divine forces. The gods behaved badly or unconventionally, not because they were inherently evil, but because life itself is complicated, unpredictable, and often requires unconventional solutions. And sometimes your greatest lesson comes from a shape-shifting horsemom. It was all part of the glorious, chaotic tapestry of existence. Manly men and magic, the Urgi problem, and why Odin didn't care. Viking society had rules, lots of them, intricate, detailed rules about land, law, and lineage. But when it came to gender, sexuality, and relationships, those rules were often negotiable, surprisingly flexible, or, to put it bluntly, do what you want, just don't get caught looking unmanly while doing it. The emphasis was on perception, on performance, and on avoiding a very specific, very dangerous label. For a Viking man, the absolute worst thing you could be called wasn't a thief, a liar, or even a coward, though those were certainly bad. It was Arga or Urgi. This was a word so loaded, so deeply insulting, that simply uttering it could lead to an immediate challenge to a duel, often to the death. Being called Arga meant you were passive, effeminate, submissive, or somehow spectacularly failed to uphold your manly duties, especially in, let's say, the romantic or sexual department. It wasn't primarily about sexual orientation in the modern sense. It was profoundly about dominance and status. Viking masculinity wasn't defined by who you were with, but by how you behaved within that relationship, and how that behavior was perceived by the community. If you were seen as yielding, as taking the bottom role, or generally being less than assertive, you weren't just mocked. Your entire reputation, your social standing, and your ability to lead or be respected could crumble faster than a poorly built longship in a North Sea storm. There are even well-documented saga accounts of men being accused of such things and then immediately demanding duels to the death to defend their honour, because clearly nothing screams, "I am the undisputed alpha male," quite like fighting someone at dawn because of a whispered rumour about cuddling. The stakes were incredibly high. Women, on the other hand, remarkably, had a little more wiggle room in this societal dance. While the society was undeniably male-dominated, and don't worry, it absolutely was, let's not romanticize everything, women in Viking cultures possessed a surprising array of social and legal rights that would make many medieval European ladies green with envy. They could own land, they could request divorces, as we'll explore. And yes, they could often make their preferences known in various matters. Still, expectations were very real. A woman who was too outspoken, too assertive, or too dominant might be labelled masculine, which, in a weird Viking twist, wasn't always an insult. Some saga heroines are actively praised for their sharp tongues, their shrewd minds, and their astonishing sword skills. But those very same traits, if found in a man and aimed the wrong way, i.e., not towards aggressive dominance, could get him publicly ridiculed or even accused of sorcery. That's right, practicing certain types of magic, particularly cider, a kind of Norse ritual often linked with emotion, prophecy, and weaving fate, was considered definitively unmanly. It was considered women's work. If a man dared to dabble in cider, people immediately assumed he was probably doing something effeminate, weaving something delicate, perhaps crying softly while doing it, and being suspiciously poetic. The irony, of course, is that Odin, the literal all-father of the Norse gods, was a renowned master of cider. But apparently, when he did it, it was strategic, visionary, and utterly badass. When you did it, it was shameful, suspect, and probably meant you needed to regain some manliness. Ah, the classic management double standard, alive and well even in the age of ravens and runes. Insults, duels, and dishonoured goats when words were weapons. In Viking society, sticks and stones could indeed break your bones, as they can anywhere else. But words? Oh, words could legally get you stabbed. Insults weren't just playground drama or a bit of harmless banter. If someone dared to publicly question your honour, your masculinity, your bravery, or even your performance in the bedroom, you could quite literally challenge them to a duel. That's right. Say the wrong thing about your neighbour's love life, and you might find yourself standing shirtless in the chilly woods at dawn, sword in hand, all because you implied your neighbour Olaf was less than enthusiastic under the furs. At the very heart of this volatile verbal landscape was something called nid, a special deeply offensive category of public insult. If you called someone Aga or Raga, both of which, as we've discussed, roughly translate to unmanly in a way no one wanted to hear, that was immediate grounds for a fight. And we're not talking about a heated argument over a tankard of mead. We're talking about legally sanctioned combat, sometimes to the death, where the community would gather to watch two men literally fight for their honour, all because of a particularly well-aimed jab at their perceived lack of virility. Now, before you leap to the conclusion that Vikings were just wildly insecure about their masculinity, though there was certainly an element of that, remember that reputation was everything. These were small, tightly knit communities where your standing, your lineage, and your perceived strength determined your influence, your alliances, and even your survival. If someone publicly accused you of being weak, cowardly, or, the ultimate insult, romantically passive, it wasn't just a personal slight, it was a devastating blow to your social, economic, and even political standing. It was career-ending, family-shaming, and deeply humiliating. And this worked both ways, which kept things interestingly volatile. If you hurled a devastating accusation, a powerful enid, and couldn't back it up, either in a formal duel or a legal court, then you could be the one exiled, shamed, or even fined into poverty. So, people chose their insults incredibly carefully, weighing the potential for deadly repercussions. And when they didn't, well, someone usually ended up bleeding rather dramatically next to a picturesque fjord. Interestingly, these disputes weren't always about what actually happened in someone's private life. Often they were about perception, rumours, offhand remarks, or a badly timed joke at a feast. All of these could trigger chaos if they cast even the slightest doubt on someone's identity, status, or reputation. In short, Viking society had zero chill when it came to trash talk. It was a verbal minefield, and everyone walked it carefully. But all of this, the intense focus on reputation and the severe consequences for perceived slights, reveals something deeper. Intimacy and public image were inextricably linked. A man's romantic reputation, his perceived prowess and dominance, was directly tied to his strength and honour in all aspects of life. If you were mocked for being passive, for being delicate, or for losing control, you didn't just lose face, you lost credibility. And once that was gone, once your honour was questioned, good luck keeping your seat at the feast, let alone finding a suitable bride or maintaining your position in the clan. The gossip mill was far more dangerous than any berserker. Adultery, less scarlet letter, more legal goat wrangling and axe-based negotiations. In Viking society, love and marriage were all well and good, full of poetry and property negotiations, until someone got caught with the neighbour's spouse. Then things escalated rapidly from quiet discomfort to loud public arguments, legal disputes, and occasionally quite bloody axe-based negotiations. Let's start with the basics. Adultery was indeed frowned upon, but notably not equally for everyone. This is where Viking pragmatism and gender roles shine through. If a married woman was caught being unfaithful, that was considered very serious business indeed. Her husband had a rather robust menu of options. He could divorce her, shame her publicly, often by parading her, stripped of her finery, through the village. Or, depending on the perceived insult to his honour and his general temperament, he might take up his sword and negotiate with the other man directly. In extreme cases, the lover might end up significantly less alive than when he so foolishly arrived at the longhouse. The consequences for the woman were severe, often involving social ostracism and loss of status. Now, if a man was unfaithful to his wife? Well, it depended. Sleeping with an unmarried woman, a thrall, a visitor, a local lass, wasn't usually a huge scandal. Perhaps a few raised eyebrows, a whispered joke, but rarely legal repercussions unless a pregnancy resulted and the man shirked his responsibilities. However, if the woman he was dallying with was married to someone else, that crossed a very clear, very dangerous line, especially if her husband had a short temper, a high sense of honor, or, even more perilously, a lot of very large, very protective brothers. And here's where it gets spicy and surprisingly progressive. If a wife found out her husband was cheating, particularly with a married woman, she could take legal action and divorce him. Viking women had astonishingly real options in this regard, options that were far more extensive than their contemporary counterparts in much of medieval Europe. In fact, sagas are full of fascinating accounts of wives who, upon discovering their husband's infidelity, calmly packed up their belongings, declared the marriage over in front of witnesses, often 3 respectable men, because due process was important, even when you were furious, and simply walked off. And often, they walked off not just with their dignity, but with their dowries intact, sometimes taking the farm, the children, and, crucially, the goats. That's right, in a society built on property and livestock, the goats were non-negotiable. Now, the Norse legal system didn't just rely on whispered accusations and heated arguments. If you claimed someone committed adultery, you actually had to prove it. This usually involved catching them in the act or, failing that, gathering unimpeachable witnesses, which, as you can imagine, made for some truly excruciatingly awkward family dinners and even more uncomfortable longhouse sleepovers. Everyone suddenly became a suspicious eavesdropper, and while physical consequences weren't always explicitly legally sanctioned, let's just say that Viking vengeance culture didn't require a permission slip. If someone dishonored your household, violated your property, or slept with your spouse, it wasn't shocking to respond with a broken door, a mysteriously burned barn, a strategically missing sheep, or a suspiciously timed hunting accident involving the offending party. The law might not have mandated violence, but societal norms often encouraged it, or at least turned a blind eye. But despite the ever-present risk of legal entanglement, social disgrace, or an axe to the head, people still cheated. Humans are, after all, remarkably consistent in their inconvenient desires. Ultimately, Viking adultery laws were less about abstract morality and more about concrete honor and property. Who got shamed, who got stabbed, and who got the livestock afterward. That's what truly mattered. So no, adultery in Viking society didn't come with scarlet letters or public stocks. It came with lawsuits, duels, and the occasional, fiercely contested goat-related custody battle. Privacy? What privacy? Intimacy in the communal longhouse. Modern romance thrives on ambience, mood lighting, scented candles, carefully curated Spotify playlists, and the sacred concept of a private space. Vikings, on the other hand, had flickering firelight, the rhythmic symphony of livestock snoring, and at least 6 relatives pretending not to notice absolutely everything. Let's talk about privacy, or more specifically, the absolute delightful lack of it. Viking homes were longhouses, colossal, open, multi-purpose buildings where entire families, often extended clans, lived, worked, ate, and yes, slept, all in one glorious communal space. Not in a weird, incestuous way usually, but in a rather practical, we're trying not to freeze to death during a particularly brutal winter kind of way. The whole clan, parents, grandparents, children, assorted workers, and sometimes a particularly beloved goat or two, shared the exact same space. Walls were optional. Curtains were luxurious, almost unheard of extravagances. The very concept of personal space, as we understand it, had not yet arrived in Scandinavia, or indeed most of medieval Europe. So, when it came to intimacy, you didn't exactly sneak off to a cozy private suite adorned with silk sheets and soft cushions. You maybe rolled over towards the fire, pulled a heavy fur blanket up to your chin, and tried your absolute best to ignore the sound of Uncle Bjorn loudly snoring 3 feet away, or the rustling of straw as Aunt Helga shifted in her sleep. Romantic? Not exactly. Efficient for keeping warm and fostering a strong sense of community? Absolutely. This pervasive lack of privacy didn't stop anyone, though. Viking culture was remarkably, almost stubbornly unbothered by the realities of communal living. People just accepted that intimacy happened, occasionally within surprisingly close earshot, occasionally while someone was stirring a simmering stew over the central hearth. Children were often conceived in crowded longhouses, leading to a kind of collective, unspoken agreement within the community. Everyone sort of developed a highly specialized skill called strategic pretending. You didn't acknowledge what was going on, you didn't comment, you definitely didn't make eye contact. You simply stared intently into the flickering flames of the central fire and thought very, very hard about fish, or perhaps the existential dread of the coming winter. Now, if you really wanted a semblance of privacy, you had options, albeit rather limited ones. Wealthier families might hang tapestries or set up rudimentary wooden dividers, which were the Viking equivalent of a neon "Do Not Disturb" sign. But for the average Norse couple, a little discretion, a lot of quiet and impeccable timing were the absolute best you could hope for. Perhaps a quick trip to the outhouse was actually a secret rendezvous point, we can only speculate. Still, despite the undeniable lack of privacy, there was no real ingrained shame associated with physical intimacy. Viking society didn't obsess over modesty or sexual repression the way later Christian Europe did. Physical intimacy was understood as natural, necessary, and part of the fundamental cycle of life. Everyone knew it happened. They just didn't want to talk about it while Grandma was within earshot, or while the goat was eyeing your breakfast. It was simply part of the raw, unvarnished tapestry of longhouse life. Babies, bees, and herbal brews, Viking family planning, sort of. Let's talk about contraception, or as the Vikings knew it, a combination of fervent hope, a surprising knowledge of local herbs, and quite possibly a touch of optimistic magic. Now, it's important to state up front, there's no detailed medical manual from the Viking Age titled How to Not Have Kids when you're busy pillaging and building a homestead. But there are clues, ethnographic parallels, and archaeological hints, and based on those, it's safe to say they had some idea of how to manage reproduction, or at least how to attempt to slow down the relentless march of sudden family expansion when necessary. First off, Viking women were incredibly knowledgeable about herbs. This wasn't just for healing battle wounds or curing a persistent fever. They possessed a deep, often orally transmitted, understanding of various plants and their potential effects on the human body, including for lessening the chance of an unexpected pregnancy. Plants like juniper, mugwort, and wild carrot were known throughout Europe for their possible contraceptive or abortifacient properties. Did they work perfectly? Probably not, certainly not by modern standards. Did they taste like sadness, regret, and damp earth? Almost certainly. But in a world without pharmacies, they were the best available option. There's also evidence that certain natural practices, such as extended breastfeeding, were strategically used to delay the next pregnancy. Nursing a child for 2 to 3 years or more can naturally suppress ovulation, thus spacing out births. Not exactly romantic, perhaps, for either parent, but surprisingly effective. Think of it as the Viking version of natural family spacing, minus the spreadsheets, the apps, or the desperate Google searches at 3 a.m. But here's the interesting twist. Viking culture didn't obsess over reproduction in the same way that later religious societies did, where every sexual act was seen solely through the lens of procreation. Children were highly valued, yes, especially sons who could fight and inherit, and daughters who could forge valuable alliances through marriage. But sex wasn't only about making heirs. Pleasure was very much part of the equation. Even in the sagas, those epic tales of valor and vengeance, romantic and sexual encounters are described with a surprising amount of realism, emotion, and sometimes even tenderness. Couples fall in love, they grow apart, they get bored, and they divorce each other without much fuss. That kind of casual acknowledgement of human nature suggests a culture that wasn't fixated on purity, guilt, or the inherent sinfulness of physical desire, but rather on pragmatism and the realities of human experience. Of course, if contraception, herbal or otherwise, failed, the primary responsibility for the resulting child, and the blame for the perceived failure almost always fell squarely on the woman. Men weren't generally expected to know much about those things. Their minds were on raids, shipbuilding, and the proper way to sacrifice a goat. A Viking man might be able to navigate a stormy sea using nothing but the stars, the flight of a raven, and a deep instinct for survival. But ask him how mugwort works as a contraceptive, and he'd likely stare at you like you'd suddenly grown a second axe out of your forehead. Practicality had its limits, especially when it came to female-specific knowledge. Same-sex relationships, it's all about the optics and avoiding ergi. If you've ever wondered whether same-sex relationships existed in Viking society, the short answer is yes. The longer, more nuanced answer is yes, but only if you really, really manage the optics, especially if you were a man. The Vikings didn't use our modern terms for sexuality. They didn't categorize people as gay, straight, or anything in between. But they certainly understood that people sometimes formed close, even romantic and sexual, bonds with others of the same gender. And while that might seem surprisingly open-minded, for an axe-swinging, raid-loving culture, it came with one massive, non-negotiable catch: honor and the pervasive fear of being labelled arga, unmanly. You see, Viking masculinity was fiercely built on the concept of dominance, not just in battle or in legal disputes, but in every single area of life, including intimate relationships. If two men were involved in a relationship, the social fallout didn't revolve around who they loved. Number It was obsessively focused on who did what. Specifically, the man who was perceived as taking the passive or submissive role in the sexual act could be publicly mocked, shamed, or, worst of all, challenged for his manhood. This wasn't about morality in the Christian sense. It was about status, power, and the maintenance of a rigidly defined gender role. A man could wear furs, braid his beard into elaborate patterns, and even serenade his best male friend with emotional, heartfelt poetry, and still be admired as a true Viking. But if someone, anyone, implied he wasn't the dominant, active force in his private life, that could utterly destroy his reputation, faster than a leaky longship in a sudden storm. This was so serious that, as we discussed earlier, there are even saga accounts of men being accused of such things and then immediately demanding duels to the death to defend their honor. Because clearly nothing screams, "I am the undisputed alpha male." Quite like fighting someone at dawn because of a whispered rumor about cuddling, or, heaven forbid, perceived passive behavior in the bedroom. The Viking ego was, evidently, extremely fragile in certain specific areas. And what about women? Honestly, same-sex relationships between women received far less attention in the surviving legal texts, sagas, and historical accounts. This is largely because their relationships weren't seen as threatening to the patriarchal social order. Two women together didn't typically produce heirs, at least not without a man's involvement, didn't directly mess with property rights in the same way, and most importantly, didn't pose a challenge to the all-important male ego or the hierarchy of male dominance. So, while we don't have abundant direct evidence, it's entirely plausible, even likely, that such relationships existed and were either quietly accepted or, more commonly, politely ignored as long as they didn't cause public scandal or disrupt the social fabric. Out of sight, out of mind, as long as the homestead was running smoothly. Interestingly, the Norse gods, as we've noted, didn't seem to care much about gender or sexual boundaries at all. Loki, as we've mentioned, had children in both male and female forms, and no one batted an eye. Odin himself was associated with practices considered unmanly. The divine realm was fluid, chaotic, and wonderfully unconstrained by human expectations. It was just the mere mortals who needed everything to fit neatly into a saga-friendly, hyper-masculine narrative. The gods played by different, far more interesting rules. Divorce, Viking style, "I'm done, I'm taking the ox." If you thought Viking marriage was all about long, boisterous feasts, the ceremonious exchange of swords, and unbreakable blood oaths, you might be absolutely stunned to learn how casually, even efficiently, it could all come to an end. Because in Viking society, divorce wasn't some drawn-out, soul-crushing legal drama that lasted for years. It was more like, right, I'm done with this. I'm taking the ox, the kids, and I wish you good luck with your terrible beard. Seriously, Viking women possessed remarkable legal autonomy in this regard. They could divorce their husbands, and they didn't need a costly lawyer, a stern judge, or even a ceremonial raven to deliver the summons. All they needed was a clear, strong voice and a couple of reliable witnesses. Here's how it worked with astonishing simplicity. A woman could unilaterally end the marriage by standing in front of a group of people, preferably at the main door of the longhouse, or, in a truly bold and perhaps awkward move, at the marital bed itself. Yes, really, talk about a public breakup. She would then declare that she was leaving, and crucially, she could state her reason. Bonus points were awarded if she could articulate her grievances eloquently and publicly, such as abandonment, physical violence, or the truly classic, "He won't stop reciting bad poetry in bed, and his snoring sounds like a dying walrus." And that was it. Once the declaration was made, the marriage was considered legally dissolved. There was no waiting period of 6 months, no endless custody battles dragged through 3 miserable winters, no archaic paperwork beyond perhaps a few verbal confirmations. Property and children would then be divided, usually according to established social custom, pre-existing marriage agreements, or through mediation by respected community elders. It wasn't always perfectly clean or amicable, of course, but it was shockingly efficient compared to nearly every other legal system of the era. What's more, Viking women often walked away from these marriages with their dowries intact, meaning the wealth and goods they brought into the marriage were hers to take back. In some cases, they even retained control of land or valuable movable property they had acquired during the marriage. Divorce certainly didn't make a woman a social pariah. In fact, many divorced women remarried, especially if they were wealthy, possessed valuable skills, or were the kind of formidable person who could wrestle a full-grown goat without flinching. Resilience was valued more than an unbroken marital record. Of course, not all separations were peaceful. Some undoubtedly involved accusations, bitter feuds, and the occasional dramatic, saga-worthy exit involving raised voices and flung earthenware. But even then, the broader culture generally accepted that sometimes people simply grew apart or found incompatible. The gods were chaotic. Why should human relationships be any different? It's also worth noting that men could divorce too, using much the same public method, though their stated reasons usually revolved around a wife's lack of obedience or her inability to manage the household efficiently, which probably tells you everything you need to know about fundamental male expectations in Viking society. Viking weddings, goats, swords, and mandatory awkwardness, with mead. If you think modern weddings can get weird with their themed photo booths and choreographed dances, just wait until you hear what the Vikings were doing with their goat sacrifices, bridal swords, and extremely awkward, potentially witnessed bedroom rituals. Viking weddings weren't just a party, they were a complex blend of a political merger, a crucial legal contract, and a raucous community event with strong opinions, deeply rooted traditions, and an even stronger smell of smoked fish and fermenting grain. The festivities themselves could be astonishingly long, lasting anywhere from a few days to a full week, depending on how wealthy, influential, or simply dramatic the families involved were. Think of it less as a simple celebration and more as a multi-day performance art piece. Game of Thrones with fewer dragons, slightly more practical attire, and a vastly increased likelihood of passive-aggressive toasts from distant relatives. Both the bride and groom underwent distinct symbolic preparations. The bride would have her hair ceremonially unbraided, a powerful visual sign of her maidenhood ending and her transition to a married woman. She might also wear an elaborate shimmering necklace, perhaps a Brisingamen-style piece, if her family was feeling extra mythological and wanted to flex their wealth. The groom, meanwhile, would often retrieve his ancestral sword, perhaps polishing it meticulously. Because nothing says, "I'm ready for a lifetime of commitment and shared responsibilities," quite like solemnly brandishing a sharpened weapon at your future in-laws. But here's where things get quintessentially Viking and rather uncomfortable for modern sensibilities: the consummation. It wasn't just encouraged, it was, in many regions, absolutely mandatory to validate the marriage. And in some communities, it had to be witnessed. Yes, witnessed. In particularly traditional areas, a few unfortunate, presumably very stoic relatives stood by the door of the bridal chamber, sometimes with torches in hand, to make sure the couple actually sealed the deal and didn't just pass out from an overdose of mead and pre-wedding nerves. Why this public display of intimacy? Because this wasn't primarily about love in our romantic sense. It was about validating a crucial contract. Marriage affected inheritance, land rights, tribal alliances, and the legitimacy of future heirs. So, if the marriage wasn't properly consummated, someone might challenge the union's legitimacy later, leading to disastrous lawsuits, blood feuds, and endless arguments over who owned what. Far simpler to just awkwardly nod from outside the curtain and hope for minimal eye contact. Of course, not every wedding was quite that dramatic or exhibitionist. In less theatrical communities, the act of consummation was simply assumed, or at worst, verified through subtle hints or loud bragging the next morning over breakfast stew. There were also numerous other rituals involving the symbolic passing of hammers, invoking Thor for protection and fertility, shared drinking horns filled to the brim, and solemn oaths sworn before witnesses, and inevitably many gallons of mead. In fact, the very term honeymoon has Viking roots. It originally referred to the practice of drinking honeymead for a full moon cycle after the wedding, specifically to boost fertility and ensure a fruitful union. Romantic, slightly sticky, and highly alcoholic. The end of the saga: love, law, and longhouse life, with a side of chaos. By now, I hope you've realised that Viking intimacy wasn't some simplistic, one-dimensional affair of mere pillaging and grunting. Far from it. It was layered, it was intensely strategic, it was wildly poetic, occasionally slightly magical, and almost inevitably, it was performed within earshot of a snoring relative or a perpetually curious goat. Viking culture didn't treat sex as something shameful, hidden, or inherently sinful. It was simply a natural, undeniable part of life, just like farming, raiding, forging tools, or constantly wondering if your neighbour was plotting a sneaky revenge attack. Intimacy in the Viking Age served multiple crucial purposes, both sacred and profoundly practical, producing heirs to continue the family line, forging indispensable alliances between powerful clans, settling long-standing scores, sometimes through marriage, sometimes through the previously mentioned axe-based negotiations, and, not insignificantly, just getting through another incredibly long, dark, and frigid winter. Passion and desire absolutely existed, a fierce, primal force, but it came tangled in a complex web of reputation, law, honour, community expectations, and the ever-present need for survival. You didn't just fall in love in the Viking Age. You made darn sure your formidable great-aunt, your entire livestock herd, and at least 3 sword-carrying uncles approved of your choice. Romance wasn't a private, personal endeavour. It was, in every meaningful sense, a group project. The sagas themselves, those sweeping epic tales of heroes and homesteads, are brimming with love, intense jealousy, remarkably clever women, and often comically emotionally unavailable men. Some stories culminate in joyous, mead-soaked weddings. Others end with one partner stoically sailing off into the fog, never to be seen again, while the other, equally stoically, stabs a cousin for merely looking smug. Either way, it's drama. Beautiful, windswept, emotionally messy drama. And through it all, Viking women were never, ever passive background characters. They were formidable forces. They seduced, they divorced, they cursed, they negotiated property deals, they managed vast households, and yes, on occasion, they even set things on fire, usually a barn for dramatic effect. They were respected for their sharp wit, feared for their potent curses, and occasionally remembered in verse for centuries, which, in Viking terms, is the ultimate compliment, a kind of eternal fame. Even their gods, as we've seen, treated love, gender, and desire like a gloriously chaotic battlefield. Loki transformed genders on a whim. Frey proudly paraded his fertility like a prize-winning squash at the village fair, and Odin, the Allfather himself, dabbled in romantic magic without so much as a blink. The divine realm absolutely set the tone. Love was powerful, unpredictable, often hilarious, and definitely not PG-rated. So, What was sex really like for the Vikings? It was communal. It was poetic. It was legally complicated. It could win you profound honour or get you utterly exiled. It was shockingly public in all the wrong moments and weirdly progressive in all the right ones. And perhaps most Viking of all, it wasn't about being perfect or pure or fitting into neat boxes. It was about surviving love with your pride, your farm, your lineage, and your sword arm all gloriously intact. Because when the Norse did love, they did it like everything else, with fire, with flair, with absolute commitment, and with absolutely no apologies. If you were a medieval peasant, don't imagine holidays meant sipping spiced wine by a roaring fire, while someone else did your chores. Oh no. Holidays were holy days, religious observances sprinkled generously across the calendar. On paper, it might have looked like you got a well-deserved break from back-breaking work. In practice, you might still be roped into helping fix the church roof, cooking stew for the entire village, or chasing the pigs that inevitably escaped during the festivities. Still, it generally beat digging turnips from dawn till dusk. The church, bless its bureaucratic heart, gave the peasantry dozens of feast days. We're talking Christmas, Easter, countless saints' days, Marian festivals and random local holidays, honouring obscure relics like St. Gertrude's toenail, probably. These weren't optional. They were sacred timeouts where you were expected to pause labour, attend Mass, and ideally reflect on your deeply sin-soaked soul. But peasants, ever pragmatic, found ingenious ways to turn these holy days into moments of genuine joy, communal feasting, and barely controlled drunkenness. Yule, for instance, wasn't just a single day, but 12 glorious, occasionally chaotic days between Christmas and Epiphany. That's 12 days of storytelling by the hearth, ale-sloshed caroling, and if you were lucky, someone might show up with a roasted pig. It was the medieval equivalent of a Netflix binge, a family potluck, and a neighbourhood block party all rolled into one. But don't get too comfortable. While your lord might not expect rent payments during a feast day, he might very well expect your son to serve wine at his table, or your daughter to help dress the lady of the manor in her saint day best. Holidays could often blur the line between sacred rest and unpaid community service. Still, there was something deeply communal about them. These weren't individual spa days, they were shared rituals. Everyone in your village, dressed in their best, reed, least muddy tunic, shared the limited food supply, and pretended for just one day that life wasn't all toil, taxes, and toothaches. So yes, peasants had holidays, a surprising number of them, in fact. But each one came with strings attached. Attend church, don't work the fields, maybe help with the mystery play, and for heaven's sake, don't get caught skipping Mass to nap in the hayloft unless you want a stern talking to from Father Bartholomew and a week's worth of penance. Ah, Yule. The most magical time of the year, assuming your idea of magic includes dead animals on spits, evergreens nailed to beams, and your uncle passed out in a haystack. Hello, dear listeners. Tonight, we're beginning with something a little less philosophical and a lot more, well, greasy. We're diving headfirst into the culinary and occasionally questionable delights served in Wild West saloons. Sure, they were known for whiskey, bar fights, and questionable piano music, but what did people actually eat there? Was it all beans and bacon, or were there surprises hiding behind those swinging doors? Perhaps an artisanal, farm-to-table, locally sourced rodent stew that would make even the most adventurous food critic from today's Romania blush. A question that keeps historians, and indeed anyone with a strong stomach, up at night. Before you get comfortable, and maybe a little hungry for something you probably shouldn't eat, do me a quick favour, like this video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It really helps more people find this particular brand of historical weirdness and encourages us to dig up more bizarre tidbits from the past. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Is it the middle of the night for you in Australia? Or just past breakfast in, say, Bucharest, perhaps enjoying a fresh Colac with your coffee? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft, saloon-appropriate hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, a journey that might just make you appreciate your modern refrigerator a little more. First thing that hit you when you walked into a Wild West saloon wasn't the piano music, usually off-key and played by someone who'd clearly had too much medicine, or the familiar sound of someone losing a week's wages at cards. Oh no, it was the smell. Forget the romanticized scent of sizzling steak and fresh cornbread, the kind you might find in a fancy restaurant in Cluj-Napoca, perhaps even with a charming rustic ambiance. The real bouquet was more like a punch to the nostrils, a dizzying concoction of odours that assaulted your senses, a complex blend of sweaty cowboys who hadn't seen a bath in weeks, wet tobacco that clung to everything like a second skin, old beer that had spilled and fermented into a pungent carpet, damp wood that groaned with the weight of years of neglect, horses that hadn't bathed in a decade and left their distinct equine aroma clinging to everything, and if you were lucky, the faintest, most ephemeral hint of something cooking in the back. A truly intoxicating mix that probably kept the less determined customers at bay. Some saloons, in a desperate attempt at civility, tried to mask this olfactory assault with fresh sawdust on the floor, hoping it would absorb some of the grime and odour, or with pipe smoke thick enough to cause temporary memory loss, a smoky haze that made the air so opaque you could almost chew it. Others, however, simply embraced it, treating the unique saloon scent as part of the establishment's character. "You don't come here for the air, stranger," barkeeps would say with a knowing wink, nonchalantly slapping flies off the counter with a rag that hadn't been cleaned since the Civil War. A rag, I might add, that likely pulled triple duty as a fly swatter, a dishcloth for cleaning glasses, and perhaps even a napkin for particularly brave or desperate patrons. It was a multifunctional piece of cloth, truly. And yet, somehow, in every dusty, dimly lit and notoriously pungent establishment, from Dodge City to Deadwood, there was always a kitchen. It might have been a rudimentary hole-in-the-wall fire pit with a single, perpetually bubbling pot of beans over embers, sending wafts of bean steam into the already thick air. It might have been nothing more than a grumpy woman in a soot-covered apron, her face etched with years of heat and hardship, stirring a cauldron of mystery stew with a spoon that doubled as a self-defense weapon against unruly customers. Or, more realistically, aggressive rats vying for a share of the culinary delights. But food was being made somewhere, by someone, and if you could actually smell it through the thick layers of sweat, tobacco and whiskey vapour, you were halfway to dinner. That is, if you could find a seat, which was often a challenge in itself, a silent battle for a piece of splintered wood. Most saloons weren't laid out like modern restaurants with cosy booths, mood lighting, and polite waiters asking about your dietary restrictions, or whether you prefer sparkling or still water. Oh no, the Wild West was far more direct. There were no servers politely asking if everything was to your satisfaction, no menus with scripted fonts and enticing descriptions, unless "Eat or Starve" scrawled on a dusty chalkboard in barely legible chalk counts as a font choice. Just a few splintered tables, rickety chairs that looked like they'd lost a fight with a buffalo and were still limping, and one long, scarred counter where you could eat, drink, argue, or all three in rapid succession, often with complete strangers breathing down your neck and occasionally bumping elbows with you. If you were a regular, the cook might bellow something like, "Beans or stew, you varmint?" and you'd shout back your choice without looking up, perhaps with a grunt of approval or a weary sigh, depending on your hunger. If you were new in town, an uninitiated greenhorn, they'd stare you down with a calculating gaze, trying to guess whether you were going to pay or pass out before the plate even hit the table. And let's be honest, in a world where passing out from exhaustion, intoxication, or sheer hunger was a common pastime, guessing correctly was a crucial skill for a saloon owner looking to turn a profit. And that's what made saloon dining so special, so uniquely authentic. It wasn't about taste, it was about pure, unadulterated survival. You ate what they had, not what you wanted, because want was a luxury the harsh frontier simply didn't cater to. You sat shoulder to shoulder next to strangers who might rob you blind or heroically save your life tomorrow, depending on their mood, the outcome of their poker hand, and the state of their whiskey consumption. The stakes were always high, and if the food made you sick, well, that's what whiskey was for. A quick swig, a hearty cough that rattled your bones, and you were ready for round two. or at least a good night's sleep on the notoriously unsanitary floor. It was a cycle of sustenance and self-medication, a frontier ritual. In the undisputed hierarchy of Wild West cuisine, beans sat squarely at the top, a veritable king among culinary commoners, a humble monarch reigning supreme over the meagre offerings. Not because they were delicious, let's not be delusional here, this wasn't fine dining, but because they were cheap, incredibly indestructible, and could survive an apocalypse, a chaotic gunfight, and a thundering stampede without breaking a sweat, emerging remarkably unscathed. Pinto beans, black beans, navy beans, whatever brownish dried legume they could get their hands on that resembled something edible, it didn't matter. If it was dry, vaguely edible, and could be boiled into submission with enough effort, it ended up in the pot. Beans were the unsung heroes of saloon kitchens, the workhorses of the frontier diet served morning, noon and night, often to men who hadn't seen a fresh vegetable since they left Kansas, or perhaps even before that, lost somewhere in the annals of forgotten dietary history. Preparation was remarkably simple, a testament to efficiency and practicality in a world where time was as precious as gold dust. Step 1. Pour beans into a massive iron pot, the kind that probably weighed more than a small horse. Step 2. Boil them for 6 hours, or sometimes even longer, depending on the cook's patience and the consistency of the fire, over a questionable smoke-filled fire, stirred occasionally with a stick that may or may not have been previously used for propping open the saloon door or stirring a vat of lye. Step 3. Serve them unceremoniously with a side of dubious salt pork, a stale biscuit, and a look of mild apology from the cook, who likely knew deep down that this wasn't exactly a Michelin star meal. Some cooks, feeling particularly ambitious, or perhaps just trying to mask the natural, rather bland flavour of the beans, might try to get fancy, adding copious amounts of lard for extra calories, and a glossy sheen, a few scarce onions if they were lucky enough to trade for them, or even a precious dash of chili powder, if they were fortunate enough to acquire such exotic spices from a passing merchant. But most didn't bother. Complexity was a luxury. In the Wild West, flavour was often considered a luxury, a frivolous indulgence, and any seasoning was whatever blew in from the open window. Usually dust, sometimes a small tumbleweed, adding an earthy, gritty texture. Beans were hearty, incredibly filling, and delightfully predictable, 3 traits that cowboys respected more than a vein of pure gold. They fueled long cattle drives under the scorching sun, providing sustained energy for arduous journeys. They powered intense poker nights where fortunes were won and lost with astonishing speed. And they gave you something, anything, to chew on while you waited for the piano player to start again, or to finally stop, or for someone to get tossed through the front window, a surprisingly common and much anticipated form of nightly entertainment. The only downside, the aftermath. One cowboy eating beans was tolerable, if a little aromatic, creating a localized atmospheric disturbance. 10 cowboys in a saloon full of beans, however, was, frankly, a biological weapon, a noxious cloud of silent but deadly gases. It's said that some bar fights weren't started by insults, cheating, or spilled whiskey, but by a single, silent but deadly betrayal near the stove, leaving a lingering, undeniable question mark in the air and igniting a brawl. Still, beans were utterly dependable. When the meat ran out, when the chickens fled, or were eaten by aforementioned mysterious stews, and when the cook had exactly 7 brain cells left from the whiskey fumes, the beans remained, unbothered, unburnt, unchanged, a monument to culinary stoicism and resilience. Some cowboys even preferred them, a testament to their practicality. They could be eaten cold, reheated endlessly, and, in a desperate pinch, even used as makeshift currency in emergencies, traded for small favours or essential supplies. Legend has it a man once bought a horse with 3 pounds of salted beans and a solemn promise never to return to that particular town, a transaction that speaks volumes about the value placed on these humble legumes. So yes, saloon food had its highs and lows, its moments of dubious delight and outright disgust. But beans? Beans were the baseline, the bedrock, the humble gaseous heartbeat of 1,000 dusty meals, a constant in a chaotic world. You didn't love them, you respected them, and sometimes in the harsh, unforgiving reality of the frontier, that was more than enough. If beans were the robust and gassy soul of Wild West saloon cuisine, then salt pork was its slightly greasier, perpetually resilient backbone, a slab of fat and meat so tough it could survive a thunderstorm, a brutal bar brawl, and 6 months rattling around in a saddlebag without changing texture or losing its unyielding character. This wasn't the gourmet pancetta you might find in fine Roman restaurants today, carefully cured and subtly flavoured. Oh no. Salt pork wasn't bacon, though cowboys loved to pretend it was as they gnawed on it with determined jaws and hopeful expressions. It was pork belly, heavily salted and often smoked, then painstakingly preserved in massive barrels with enough brine to season a small ocean. The salt, the unsung hero of preservation, kept it from rotting, and also, arguably, from being truly edible in a palatable sense. Cooked right, a rare and almost mythical occurrence spoken of in hushed tones, salt pork was tolerable, even surprisingly good. Fried up in a screaming hot skillet, served crispy and sizzling, it had flavour, glorious grease that coated your insides with a comforting film, and that satisfying crunch that made you briefly forget the rest of your dinner came from a can labelled Mysterious Contents, use at your own risk. But cooked wrong, which, let's be honest, happened with alarming frequency, often due to a cook's haste or sheer indifference. It was like chewing a salted boot heel dipped in axle grease, a true culinary challenge for even the most desperate and hungry. It was a test of willpower and jaw strength. Still, salt pork, in its own unique way, had its devoted fans, primarily due to its sheer practicality and calorie density. It was easy to transport, incredibly hard to ruin, though many a cook dedicated their life to trying with varying degrees of success, and gave even the blandest pot of beans a salty punch of joy, or at least a compelling reason to drink more whiskey to wash down the lingering taste. Cooks in saloons were masters of frugality. They wasted absolutely nothing. The rendered fat, a golden elixir, was a precious commodity, used to fry everything from potatoes to biscuits, lending a unique flavour that was 90% grease, 10% regret, and 100% vital calories. The rind, that tough, chewy outer layer, was tossed into stews for added flavour and texture, or, in moments of extreme cruelty or misguided generosity, given to unsuspecting dogs, or to unlucky newcomers who didn't know the difference. One bite and they'd learn real quick that the barkeep wasn't joking when he said, "Chew slow or choke proud," a lesson learned through gastronomic suffering. Salt pork was remarkably versatile too, a true culinary chameleon. It could be diced into beans, slapped unceremoniously on biscuits, fried alone as a greasy, salty snack, or gnawed at like jerky on long rides, slowly but surely wearing down your molars. Cowboys packed it like treasure, knowing it was the ultimate insurance policy against starvation, a guaranteed source of calories, and saloon cooks leaned on it heavily when the chickens ran off or the stew pot got too thin, providing a much-needed boost of flavour and substance. It wasn't elegant, and it sure wasn't healthy by any modern medical standard, but in a world where you might ride 60 miles across a desolate prairie before your next hot meal, salt pork got the job done, and if you survived it, well, you were definitely stronger for it, perhaps even immune to lesser culinary affronts, your digestive system a fortress. In the vast and unforgiving landscape of the Wild West, stew was the great culinary equalizer, hot, vaguely meaty, and deeply, profoundly suspicious. It was the one thing almost every saloon served, no matter how ramshackle the kitchen, how dubious the ingredients, or how many rats were seen scampering across the floor, often considered extra protein if you were desperate. Why? Because stew was the perfect cover story for whatever odds and ends the cook had lying around, whatever culinary scraps could be salvaged, or, more accurately, whatever ingredients couldn't legally be described to a paying customer without inciting a riot. The base was remarkably simple, a testament to culinary ingenuity born of necessity, a large pot, a roaring fire, and a generous dose of ambition, or utter desperation. You started with water, perhaps some beans or potatoes if they were available, and then you tossed in whatever hadn't walked away yet, whatever meat could be scrounged. Beef? Sure, if you were lucky enough to have it. Rabbit? Definitely. Squirrel? Yep, a common and often surprising addition. Rattlesnake? If it wasn't biting anymore and had a decent enough chunk of meat, toss it in. One intrepid traveller once claimed he found a bootstring in his bowl, a piece of old leather stewing in the pot. He wasn't even mad, he said, with a wry grin and a weary sigh. It was the most chewable part, a testament to the toughness of frontier meats. Meat quality varied wildly, making each bowl of stew a true gastronomic roulette, a roll of the dice. Some stews, in rare moments of grace, had tender chunks of beef from the local butcher, a culinary treat to be savoured. Others, well, they had meat, the kind you didn't ask about, the kind that might have a faint, unsettling odour that lingered in the air. If the cook looked particularly nervous, avoiding your gaze, and the local dog population had recently decreased, you just ate around the chewy bits, swallowed hard, and prayed for a quick digestive journey, hoping for the best. Vegetables, when available, were usually boiled into oblivion, stripped of all colour, texture, and nutritional value. Carrots became orange smudges, barely recognisable. Onions disappeared completely, their presence only hinted at by a faint, tear-inducing vapour that tickled your nose. Potatoes, the hardiest of the bunch, held on the longest, bravely resisting the heat, but eventually surrendered, becoming soft, bland lumps that dissolved on the tongue. The result? A bubbling brown-grey slurry that smelled way better than it looked, a low bar to be fair, and tasted better than you'd expect, assuming enough salt was thrown in to mask all other, less desirable flavours. Spices were a luxury, a mythical concept almost. Most stew got its kick from whatever was on the cook's hands or knife, and given the prevailing hygiene standards, that could be a lot of flavour. If you got black pepper, a truly rare commodity, you were in a fancy place, probably one with actual tablecloths and maybe even a separate dining area. If you got chili powder, a fiery indulgence, congratulations. Your sinuses were about to be cleared by force regardless of any existing congestion, a truly invigorating experience. But despite the mystery, the dubious ingredients, and the often unappealing appearance, stew was comfort food for the weary cowboy. It was hot, it was filling, and it could be stretched endlessly by just adding more water, a true culinary magic trick that made a little go a long way. One pot might feed a dozen men, or be reheated 3 days in a row, until it developed the consistency and personality of old glue, stubbornly refusing to be eaten, yet still providing sustenance. You didn't eat stew because it was delicious. You ate it because it was there, because it was warm, and because nothing else in town was edible unless you liked chewing tobacco and regret. Just remember, never ever ask what's in it. Because in the Wild West, ignorance wasn't just bliss, it was dinner, and sometimes a matter of self-preservation, ensuring you finished your meal without too many unsettling questions. Not every cowboy could afford a steak. In fact, most couldn't, unless they just struck it rich in a gold mine, or won big at the poker table. But nearly every saloon, regardless of its size or reputation, had something bread-like to soak up the ubiquitous stew, or simply to provide a few precious calories to keep a man going. That something usually came in one of two distinct forms: soft, flaky biscuits that were heavenly when fresh, a rare and fleeting joy, often spoken of in hushed, reverent tones, or hardtack, which was basically bread's undead, unyielding cousin, a flat, hard cracker that defied decay. Let's start with the biscuits, those glorious, buttery creations. When done right, which again was rare but utterly magical, like finding a unicorn in the desert, they were warm, buttery, and flaky enough to convince a man he'd stumbled into a proper kitchen, perhaps even one from a bygone era of culinary excellence. Cooks who could consistently make good biscuits were local legends, revered almost as much as a sharpshooter or a trustworthy farrier. Some claimed their secret was copious amounts of lard, rendering them delightfully greasy and rich. Others swore by buttermilk, lending a subtle tang and a tender crumb. A few probably just had lucky hands, an uncanny knack for dough, and extremely low standards among their clientele, who were simply grateful for anything warm and edible. These biscuits were best served alongside beans or stew, used to mop up whatever broth hadn't burned your tongue off with its fiery heat. They were often made in cast-iron pans, baked over open flames in the saloon's humble kitchen, and served with a suspicious chunk of butter that might have seen better days, or a generous splash of molasses if the place was truly fancy and had a consistent supply of such a sweet luxury. And then there was hardtack, a slab of flour and water, utterly devoid of yeast or leavening, baked until it could survive a nuclear winter, a meteor impact, and the apocalypse with unwavering structural integrity. Originally made for soldiers and sailors enduring long, arduous voyages, it found its way west thanks to one simple, undeniable fact. It never went bad, practically defying the laws of nature. It also barely qualified as food, more of a dietary challenge, a test of fortitude. Eating hardtack required strategy, patience, and a jaw of pure steel. First, you'd inspect it for weevils, which wasn't a deal-breaker for many, merely an added crunch that some cowboys surprisingly enjoyed, considering it extra protein. Then, you'd embark on the arduous process of soaking it in stew, coffee, or whiskey until it softened. This could take anywhere from 10 minutes to 2 presidential terms, or until your patience finally ran out and you simply gave up. Even after prolonged soaking, chewing hardtack was a monumental commitment. You didn't just eat it, you grappled with it, a primal struggle between man and baked goods, a battle of wills. Dentists, had they existed in abundance and been affordable in the Wild West, probably made a small fortune off cowboys who challenged a piece and lost a tooth in the process. But here's the crucial thing. Both biscuits and hardtack, in their own unique ways, served their essential purpose. They were cheap, making them accessible to even the most cash-strapped cowboy. They were portable, easy to carry on long journeys. They filled you up, providing crucial energy to keep a man going for hours. And in a world where calories mattered more than cuisine, where sheer survival trumped culinary delight, that was enough. So, if you strolled into a dusty saloon and saw a plate of steaming biscuits, you counted your blessings, perhaps even offered a silent prayer of thanks to the culinary gods. If they handed you a hardtack puck the size of your palm, well, at least it came with a story and maybe a chipped tooth, a badge of honour in the rough and tumble West. You learn to appreciate the simple things. If you think modern coffee from your local cafe in Bucharest is strong, expertly brewed and served with artistic flair, try cowboy coffee. A brew so potent it didn't just wake you up, it stared back, challenged your very existence, and dared you to blink first, often leaving you wide-eyed and slightly trembling. Coffee in the Wild West was less about nuanced taste and more about pure, unadulterated survival, a necessary jolt to face the day. It wasn't roasted by origin, meticulously filtered through fancy gadgets, or topped with oat milk foam art and a dusting of cinnamon. Oh no, it was ground roughly, or often not at all, just whole beans thrown in, dumped unceremoniously into a kettle and boiled until the liquid turned black, viscous, and vaguely sentient, like a dark force gathering strength within the pot. The standard recipe, passed down through generations of weary cowboys, prospectors, and weary travellers, went something like this. Take water from whatever source you had, hopefully not downstream from the horses, though sometimes that was unavoidable, adding an authentic flavour. Throw in a handful of coffee grounds, measured not by a precise spoon but by instinct, aggression, and the sheer desire for a kick. Boil it hard, with no gentle simmering or delicate temperature control. Don't strain it, don't question it. Just pour and pray that it doesn't spontaneously combust in your tin cup. The result? A thick, dark concoction that smelled like burnt dreams and tasted like vengeance, or perhaps just very strong, bitter mud with a distinct mineral tang. It wasn't uncommon for the last sip to contain more grounds than liquid, which meant cowboys got both caffeine and fibre in one heroic gritty gulp, a 2-in-1 dietary supplement. And yet, despite its crude preparation and formidable taste, they loved it. Coffee kept you warm on cold desert mornings, its heat radiating through your very bones, a comforting warmth against the biting wind. It kept you awake through endless night watches, guarding against rustlers and restless livestock, sharpening your senses. It masked hangovers from questionable whiskey and help digest even more questionable stew. It was fuel, comfort, and a form of liquid punishment, all in one battered tin cup. Saloons didn't always serve coffee unless they had a dedicated kitchen and a cook brave enough to brew it. But if they did, it came out boiling hot, probably old from sitting on the stove for hours and strong enough to strip paint off a barn door. A truly formidable beverage. One grizzled cowboy, after taking a bracing swig, described it as like drinking a kick from a mule, but you miss it when it's gone, a sentiment many shared. Fancy folk might have added a lump of precious sugar or some canned milk if available, but everyone else just grimaced and powered through, accepting their fate as part of the daily grind. And if a saloon had been reheating the same pot all day, letting it stew and concentrate, you'd get the boldest brew known to man, thick as tar, twice as resentful, and capable of making your teeth hum with its sheer potency. It's worth noting that some cooks, in a desperate attempt at economy and resourcefulness, reused old grounds to stretch the pot even further. This economy method led to coffee that tasted like disappointment and regret, a truly soul-crushing brew, but it still counted as coffee. Because in the Wild West, you didn't drink coffee for pleasure. You drank it to feel alive, to stay alert, and to simply stay that way, one burning, gritty sip at a time. In the vast and unforgiving landscape of the Wild West, meat wasn't just food, it was currency, a profound status symbol, and occasionally a direct test of bravery. If you were a truly fortunate soul who had just struck it rich in a gold mine, or won big at the poker table, you might walk into a saloon and confidently order a steak, a grand gesture of newfound prosperity. What you got, however, depended entirely on luck, timing, and whether the cook held a personal grudge against your face, or, more likely, simply didn't care about your culinary preferences. Steak, in theory, was a luxury, a rare treat. In reality, it was often a tough, sinewy, overcooked slab of beef that had been fried in a pan with generous amounts of lard until it was scorched into unyielding obedience and served with exactly zero garnish or accompanying vegetables. If you dared to ask for it medium rare, an unheard of concept, the cook would likely just stare at you with a greasy ladle in hand, a silent but intimidating challenge, until your moustache wilted from sheer intimidation and you quickly rescinded your request. When fresh beef wasn't available, and let's be brutally honest, it usually wasn't, unless you were practically standing next to a freshly butchered steer still warm from the kill, saloons turned to other, more preserved options, embracing necessity. Dried jerky, so tough it could double as shoe leather for a particularly resilient boot. Salted buffalo, a massive undertaking, but a significant source of meat, occasionally appearing on the menu. Venison, if a skilled hunter had passed through, or even wild boar if someone had gotten incredibly lucky on a hunt. And by lucky, we mean managed to hit it and drag it back before the buzzards or coyotes did their job. In mining towns or far-flung settlements, where fresh supplies were rarer than a sober gambler on a Saturday night, meat offerings got significantly more creative. Squirrel stew, rattlesnake roast, roast jackrabbit with seasoning, which often meant dust and a general lack of identifiable flavour. If it had legs and didn't belong to a customer's horse, it was generally considered fair game for the pot. Sometimes you were served meat, and no one, not even the cook, told you what it was. That was a subtle but clear sign to eat quietly, not ask inconvenient questions, and simply accept your fate, whatever creature had ended up on your plate. If you chewed too long, your jaw aching, or, God forbid, found something resembling a whisker, a suspicious bone fragment, or an unexpected claw, you just sipped your whiskey, nodded solemnly, as if you understood, and accepted your fate. There was also the pervasive risk of age. Some meats had been hanging around long enough to earn names from the regulars, becoming almost legendary in their longevity. Cooks would meticulously slice off the truly bad rotten parts, drown the rest in copious amounts of thick gravy, and confidently tell you it was well aged, or aged to perfection, a culinary masterpiece of endurance. If your plate twitched slightly when you poked it with a fork, a faint, unsettling tremor, you were entitled to one single raised eyebrow and nothing more. Complaining was ill-advised unless you fancied a quick, involuntary exit to the dusty streets outside via the front window, or a confrontation with a very large, very angry cook wielding a cleaver. Still, In those rare, precious moments when the meat was truly fresh and the cook wasn't entirely drunk or distracted, you might get a real meal. A sizzling slab of beef, perhaps a fried egg on top, its yolk still runny, and maybe a tender biscuit on the side. A rare, glorious plate that reminded you why people endured gunfights, train robberies, and endless days on the trail for such simple pleasures. It was a fleeting moment of culinary bliss, a taste of civilization. But most of the time, you ate what was there, hoped it didn't eat you back, and counted your blessings that it was, at the very least, warm, filling, and, mostly, non-lethal. In a Wild West saloon, pie wasn't really a dessert in the modern sense, the kind you might find artfully arranged in a pastry shop in Sibiu. It was more of a happy accident, a rare, glorious result of a cook with spare ingredients, a functioning oven, a luxury in itself, and a tiny sliver of mercy in their hardened heart. But if there was one reliable sweet comfort, a glimmer of culinary joy amidst the dust and grim reality, it was cornbread, made from simple cornmeal, water or milk, lard, of course always lard, and sometimes a dash of baking powder if the cook remembered and had access to it. Cornbread was the Swiss Army knife of the frontier menu, incredibly versatile and adaptable. It could be baked in pans, fried in skillets, or even dropped by spoonfuls directly into boiling stew if someone was in a hurry, or exceptionally lazy and wanted to make a dumpling of sorts, adding another layer of mystery to the stew. Alone, a simple slice of cornbread was often dry, crumbly, and only slightly sweet, depending on who made it and how generous they were with the precious sugar, if any. It was always best served fresh, meaning, in most cases, it was almost never fresh, often having sat on the stove for hours, cooling and hardening. More often, you'd get a wedge that had been sitting near the stove since sunrise, hardened like a miner's conscience after a particularly lucrative gold strike, capable of chipping a tooth if you weren't careful. But here's where the magic, the true alchemy of the frontier kitchen happened. Molasses. A dark, sticky, syrupy miracle that transformed even the driest, most unappealing slab of cornbread into something just shy of glorious, a genuine delight. It was the cowboy's frosting, the outlaw's drizzle, the lonely gambler's last bit of joy before losing everything on a bad hand of poker. Molasses was affordable, kept remarkably well in the heat of the arid climate, and most importantly, masked the sins of even the driest baked goods. If a saloon had a barrel of it, you were truly in luck, a fortunate soul indeed. If they warmed it before serving, a rare act of hospitality, you were practically eating at a 5-star establishment by frontier standards. A true culinary luxury. Some cooks, feeling inspired and perhaps a little adventurous, would go a step further, pouring molasses over skillet-fried cornbread and tossing in a pinch of salt or spice, creating a delightful sweet and savoury combination. It wasn't quite cake, but it felt like it if you'd been chewing jerky and hardtack all week, your taste buds longing for any semblance of sweetness or richness. Cornbread with molasses became the default dessert, the go-to sweet treat, quick, cheap, filling, and just sweet enough to calm your nerves after a rough ride or a close call in the poker room. No elaborate icing, no whipped cream, no fancy frills, just grit, grain, and gooey, unadulterated satisfaction. And for many, in the unforgiving expanse of the Wild West, it was more than enough, a small but significant comfort in a hard world. Because when your life involved endless cattle drives, choking dust storms, and the occasional shootout, dessert didn't need to sparkle. It just needed to remind you that not everything in the West was trying to kill you. If you were lucky enough to stumble into a saloon before noon, preferably sober, not bleeding, and with enough coins to jingle convincingly in your pocket, you might have been offered eggs and chicken. And if so, you were in the presence of a true miracle, or more likely a cleverly laid trap disguised as breakfast. Let's start with the eggs. Fresh eggs in the Wild West were gold. Not actual gold, mind you, but nearly as rare and equally fragile, prone to cracking under the slightest pressure. Chickens weren't raised for fun. They were cranky, prone to wandering off and getting lost, and occasionally stolen by desperate rustlers, eaten by various predators, or simply lost to foxes. If a saloon had eggs on hand, they either had their own resilient flock of chickens, a rare sight, a remarkably reliable local supplier, even rarer, or a secret smuggling operation from the next town over, risking life and limb for a carton of fragile ovals. What kind of eggs were they? Hopefully chicken, possibly duck, maybe something else entirely. You learned very quickly not to ask too many pointed questions about your food sources. You ordered eggs, and what you got depended entirely on the cook's mood, the egg's actual age, and the phase of the moon, which some believed influenced their freshness. Some were scrambled to disguise colour, texture, and perhaps a faint unsettling aroma. Others were fried until the yolks turned to leather, hard and unyielding discs, and if it wobbled slightly when it hit your plate, a subtle, ethereal quiver that was a clear sign from the universe to order whiskey instead, and quickly to drown your sorrows. As for chicken, it was on the menu, a rare and coveted item, but not often actually available. If the menu, or chalkboard more likely, said fried chicken, what you'd probably get was a scrawny bird that died angry, tough, bony and fried in lard, until every last drop of flavour tapped out, leaving behind a bland, chewy husk. Chicken wasn't always worth the effort of chewing, but it was meat. It was hot. And it wasn't beans again, so folks ate it gratefully, often gnawing directly off the bone with a quiet, determined desperation. You might get a drumstick the size of your thumb, a meagre offering, or, if you were truly blessed by the culinary gods, a whole quarter roasted on an open flame, its skin slightly singed but gloriously crispy. You might also find a feather in your gravy, a charming, authentic touch that was just part of the frontier experience, a reminder of the origins of your meal. Breakfast offerings of eggs and chicken were a distinct status symbol for saloons. They proudly proclaimed, "We have food that didn't come from a can or a barrel that was buried for 3 months and then dug up." If the eggs were warm and the chicken wasn't bone dry, you'd tell your buddies for weeks, regaling them with tales of culinary luxury and frontier hospitality. And if it gave you food poisoning, well, that was just the West reminding you who was in charge. A gentle nudge from destiny, a lesson in humility. Still, there was something hopeful about ordering eggs. They meant morning, they meant survival, and just maybe they meant you'd live to drink again by nightfall, perhaps even enjoy another round of mystery stew, your stomach now fortified against all manner of culinary assaults. In any Wild West saloon that dared to serve food, a truly enigmatic, often shadowy and perpetually smoke-covered figure existed whose power rivaled that of the bartender, the sheriff, and even the sternest town preacher combined. The cook. This individual, often unshaven, always irritable, and perpetually covered in a fine sheen of grease and sweat, was either a life-saving culinary genius who could conjure a meal from thin air, or a gastronomic war criminal who could turn a simple meal into a memorable trauma. There was absolutely no comfortable middle ground. You'd never see them smile, their faces often set in a permanent scowl, but you'd definitely remember their cooking for days, either in profound gratitude for sustenance or agonizing gastrointestinal trauma that made you question all your life choices. Saloon cooks weren't formally trained chefs with delicate French techniques or even a basic understanding of food safety. Oh no. They were usually ex-miners who couldn't swing a pickaxe anymore, their bodies broken by the harsh labour. They were ex-cons looking for a way to stay out of trouble, or at least out of jail, their past murky and best left unexamined. Or they were simply ex-somethings who knew how to build a fire and weren't afraid of questionable meat, a crucial skill in the frontier. Their kitchen was a rudimentary, often chaotic affair, a flickering fire pit, a dented cast-iron stove that looked like it had survived a cannonball strike, and a single, mighty cast-iron pan that hadn't been washed since the California gold rush, its surface a testament to layers of hardened grease and forgotten meals. And yet, somehow, against all odds, they managed to feed entire saloons full of hungry, often unruly, and frequently desperate men. On a good day, a truly exceptional day when the stars aligned and the cook was in a benevolent mood, they'd whip up a pot of chili that could bring a man to tears, in a good way, of course, from the spices and warmth. The biscuits would be warm, flaky, and surprisingly tender. The beans would be cooked through, no longer rock hard, and the cornbread just sweet enough to remind you of a distant, perhaps idealized home, a faint whisper of comfort. But on a bad day, and there were many bad days, often dictated by the cook's hangover, the beans were scorched, sticking stubbornly to the bottom of the pot. The meat was a uniform, unappetizing grey, and the stew had an unsettling, oily layer that actually moved when the pot was still, an ominous sign. You didn't complain. You absolutely couldn't. Saloon etiquette was crystal clear, a cardinal rule: never, under any circumstances, insult the cook. Because the cook controlled everything: the salt, the grease, the mystery meat ratio, and your very sustenance. If they liked you, you got the freshest cut of whatever meat was available, a true privilege. If not, you got the spoon scrapings from last night's disaster, reheated into a horrifying, chilly surprise that would haunt your dreams for weeks. These cooks also often doubled as the saloon's unofficial bouncer, a formidable presence. No one in their right mind wanted to get hit by a ladle that had just survived frying a pound of salt pork, or worse, stirring a week-old stew. And if the cook had a cleaver, which many did, always kept ominously close at hand, glinting in the dim light, they could clear a room faster than a shotgun blast, simply by a menacing glance and a heavy footfall. Despite their perpetually foul moods, their distinct lack of social graces, and their undeniably questionable culinary methods, these cooks were vital. They kept cowboys on their feet, prospectors from passing out from hunger, and weary travellers from collapsing mid-sentence. They worked long hours in suffocating heat and smoke, took insults of seasoning, and lived by a single, unwavering rule: if you don't like it, there's the door, or the whiskey. So, whether they were your gastronomic saviour or your culinary saboteur, you always nodded respectfully to the cook, perhaps even muttered a quick thank you. Because in the Wild West, they held your stomach and your fate in their greasy, glorious hands. Now that we've walked through the swinging doors, sniffed the dubious stew, and stared down a pickled egg floating ominously in a foggy jar, the real, burning question remains: would you actually eat the food served at a Wild West saloon? Let's be brutally honest. Our modern taste buds, accustomed to the delicate flavours of a Romanian mixi or a perfectly seasoned sarmal, lovingly prepared, might not survive the experience. The beans were basic, often unseasoned and endlessly repetitive. The meat was a gamble, often questionable and rarely tender. And the stew, oh, the stew was more mystery than meal, a culinary enigma wrapped in a brown liquid. You'd need strong teeth, a stomach made of iron, and the kind of ravenous appetite that comes from riding 40 miles across a sun-baked prairie on a sunburned horse with nothing but dust in your lungs. But here's the crucial thing. For the cowboys, miners, gamblers, and misfits of the American frontier, saloon food wasn't about gourmet flavour, artistic plating, or Michelin stars. It was about pure, unadulterated fuel. It was about calories to keep you going. It was about warmth to ward off the chill of the desert nights. It was about a warm plate between gunfights, train robberies, or another night sleeping uncomfortably in a barn next to a mule named Regret. It was, quite simply, about survival. You didn't ask where the meat came from because you probably didn't want to know. You didn't complain if the biscuit crumbled like chalk in your mouth, leaving a dry, powdery residue. You just sat down, ate what was handed to you with grim determination, and washed it down with something strong enough to kill bacteria, or at least make you stop caring about it, which, frankly, was equally effective. And when food was good, when the beans were surprisingly fresh and perfectly cooked, the coffee didn't bite back with a vengeance, and the cook had spared a little precious molasses for the cornbread. It felt like a genuine miracle. A fleeting moment of deliciousness in a hard, unforgiving world. It was a taste of civilization, a reminder that not everything was a struggle. So, would you eat it? If you lived back then, yes. You wouldn't just eat it. You'd be profoundly thankful for it, perhaps even shedding a tear of gratitude. You'd scrape the bowl clean, leaving no trace, wipe the plate with your crust of bread, or hardtack if you were truly unlucky, and order seconds with coins that still smelled suspiciously of dynamite and horse sweat. You'd laugh with strangers, perhaps curse the cook under your breath, but never to their face, toast with whiskey that burned like a prairie fire, and maybe, just maybe, end the night with a slice of pie and a story worth telling. Because saloon food wasn't glamorous. It was gritty, greasy, and undeniably real. And in a world where the West was still wild, untamed, and relentless, that was more than enough to keep a man going. Perhaps it makes you wonder what culinary innovations will emerge from the necessities of our own future, doesn't it?
Hello, dear listeners. Welcome back to another trip down history lane, where we uncover the hilariously grim realities of the past. Tonight, we're strapping on our imaginary corsets and diving headfirst into the utterly bonkers world of Tudor women. Forget the romantic portraits and fancy gowns from those TV shows. The truth is, you probably wouldn't survive a month in one of those outfits without a severe case of the vapours and an impromptu appendectomy from your whalebone stays. Before we get comfy, or more accurately, before you realise how uncomfortable life used to be, do me a quick favour. Like this video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It really helps more people find this little corner of historical shenanigans. And I'm always curious. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. All right, dim the lights, maybe grab a cup of tea or something stronger. You might need it. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1535. The good news, you're alive. Give yourself a pat on the back. You've successfully navigated the perilous waters of medieval childhood diseases, which is a triumph in itself. The bad news, you're a woman in Tudor England, which means your existence falls somewhere between property and decoration, depending on your social class, and probably a very tired beast of burden. Your bed is a straw-stuffed mattress that doubles as an insect sanctuary. There's no memory foam, no fluffy pillows, and definitely no Egyptian cotton sheets. Just a wool blanket that hasn't been washed since last Christmas, and now smells like a pungent combination of sweat, wood smoke, and whatever your husband, God bless his smelly socks, dragged in last night. You blink awake as church bells clang in the distance. It's the Tudor version of an alarm clock, only louder, more persistent, and with a side order of religious obligation that reminds you your soul is probably already damned. Your home, if you're among the common folk, is a timber-framed dwelling with one room, a dirt floor, and that special open-concept design where your entire family, your chickens, and at least 3 types of rodents all share the same delightful living space. The smell. Oh, it's a fragrant symphony. A subtle blend of yesterday's pottage, which is basically gruel but sounds fancier, human waste from the chamber pot in the corner, and the distinct aroma of wet wool. Because in Tudor England, it's always somehow damp, and everyone smells a bit like a well-used sheep. Scented candles haven't been invented, and even if they had been, they'd just be another fire hazard in your tinderbox home. You try to stretch, but immediately regret it because your back aches from yesterday's endless chores. You're 32 years old, which in Tudor terms is practically ancient for a woman. You've survived at least 6 pregnancies, birthed maybe 3 live children. The rest are, well, elsewhere. And your body feels like it's been through a jousting tournament. Getting out of bed is a gamble. The floor is cold, probably wet from last night's rain, which leaks through the thatched roof during every storm. Your bare feet are calloused from years without proper shoes, making them your only defense against the splinters, nails, and whatever your children dropped on the floor before bed. Oh, and privacy. What's that? Your entire family, husband, children, maybe even a servant if you're lucky enough to have one, are all waking up in the same space. There's no bedroom, no bathroom, no me time. Just communal everything, including the charming sounds of bodily functions. Even your thoughts don't feel entirely your own in a society where women's opinions are about as welcome as the plague. And this, dear listener, is just how your day starts. It only gets more exciting and more backbreaking from here. So, you've managed to drag yourself out of your Tudor bed of despair. Congrats. Now your real job begins. The one that will break your back, chafe your hands raw, and never, ever pay you a single penny. Because being a woman in Tudor England isn't a gender. It's an unpaid, 24-hour occupation. Your morning routine makes modern working mothers look like they're on permanent vacation in Barbados. First, you need to revive last night's fire or start a new one. No matches, no lighters, just a tinderbox, some flint, and a fervent prayer that it catches before everyone freezes to death. The fire isn't just for warmth. It's your stove, your water heater, and pretty much your only piece of technology. Next, you'll need to prepare breakfast for the household. Hope you like pottage. This gloppy, bland porridge, made from whatever grains and vegetables you have on hand, will be a staple of your diet. You'll cook it in the same pot you've been using for years, suspended over the fire on an iron hook. If your family is prosperous, maybe there's a bit of salted meat or a precious egg to add to the mix. If not, well, oats and water make a meal too. Technically speaking, your daily chores read like a medieval marathon. You'll milk the cow, if you have one, feed the chickens, collect eggs, sweep the floor with a bundle of twigs. No Dyson vacuum here. Empty chamber pots, fetch water from the well or river, wash clothes by beating them on rocks. Soap is an expensive luxury. Spin wool, weave cloth, mend garments, make candles, brew ale, churn butter, make cheese, preserve food, tend the garden, and prepare more meals. And unlike your husband, who might take breaks, chat with friends at the local alehouse, or have specific working hours, your labour never ends. Dawn to dusk, and sometimes beyond, you work. Your hands are perpetually chapped, your back chronically sore, your arms muscled from constant lifting, carrying and wringing. If you're a woman of higher status, you don't escape labour. It just takes different forms. You'll manage servants, oversee the household accounts, preserve your family's social standing through careful etiquette, which involves a lot of stiff curtsying and pretending to enjoy terrible poetry. Produce heirs, we'll get to that joy later, and maintain a spotless reputation. Less physical labour, perhaps, but the mental burden is crushing. The worst part? All this backbreaking work is simply expected. No one thanks you. No one notices, unless you fail to do it. The Tudor household doesn't function without women's labour, yet that labour is invisible, taken for granted as natural as breathing. Your husband works his trade or tends his fields, and comes home expecting dinner on the table. Your children need constant attention. Your in-laws judge your housekeeping abilities. The church demands your piety and submission. And somewhere in all of this, you're supposed to find time to preserve your feminine virtue, which seems like an impossible feat when you're elbow deep in laundry water. So, you grip your broom, ignore the blisters, and keep sweeping, because in Tudor England, a woman's work isn't just never done. It's the foundation that the entire society is built upon, even while that same society tells you it's worthless. Now that you're thoroughly exhausted just thinking about your daily chores, let's talk about what you're wearing while performing this endless labour. Because Tudor fashion wasn't just uncomfortable, it was actively trying to kill you. If you're a common woman, your wardrobe consists of a linen shift. Your underwear, basically. A kirtle, a simple dress. Maybe an overgown, if you're slightly prosperous. An apron, a cap to cover your hair, because showing your hair is apparently scandalous. And possibly a cloak, if weather demands it. Everything is made from wool or linen, scratchy, heavy, and difficult to clean. Your clothes aren't just uncomfortable. They're a walking fire hazard. Those long skirts trailing near the open hearth. Perfect for catching stray embers. More than a few women and their voluminous garments went up in flames while cooking. Who needs safety when you can have modesty, right? But if you think common women had it bad, wait until you hear about the fashion requirements for noble ladies. Their clothing wasn't just garments. It was architectural engineering with a side of torture. Let's start with the foundations. First, a linen shift, then a stiffened kirtle. Next comes the pièce de résistance, the corset, or pair of bodies, as they called it. This isn't your cute Victorian waist cincher. It's a brutally rigid contraption made from layers of linen stiffened with paste and whalebone. It compresses your rib cage, pushes your breasts up to your chin, and makes breathing optional rather than necessary. Trying to sit down in one is a geometrical challenge requiring advanced mathematics. Next, the farthingale, a framework of hoops that makes your skirt stick out like a walking bell. It's heavy, it's cumbersome. Doorways become your nemesis. Staircases are death traps. Then comes layer upon layer of rich fabric. Velvet, damask, silk, brocade. All gloriously beautiful and heavier than a small child. A noblewoman's outfit could weigh up to 15 pounds, all hanging from her compressed waist and shoulders. The sleeves are detachable, and often so heavily embroidered they could stand up on their own. The neckline, depending on the decade and the current monarch's preference, might plunge dangerously low or rise up to your ears with a supportive framework called a partlet. On your head, a French hood or gable headdress, both requiring your hair to be pulled back so tightly it gives you a perpetual facelift. Many noble women experienced traction alopecia from their hairstyles, going bald at the temples and hairline. But beauty is pain, as they say. And a Tudor woman's beauty belonged not to herself, but to her family's status. Speaking of beauty, hope you like lead poisoning. The ideal Tudor complexion was pale to the point of translucence, symbolizing a life of leisure indoors, as opposed to the tanned skin of working women. To achieve this deathly pallor, women applied ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar. Yes, actual lead, the same toxic metal we now carefully remove from paint and gasoline. Tudor women were smearing it directly onto their largest organ. This potent poison would be absorbed through the skin, causing everything from tooth loss to neurological damage and infertility. But the beautiful corpse look wouldn't be complete without those blood-red cheeks and lips. For this, women turned to vermilion, mercuric sulfide, or red ochre, iron oxide, mixed with beeswax. Mercury poisoning added tremors, psychosis, and drooling to the lead poisoning symptoms you were already enjoying. What price beauty? Your teeth going black from all these heavy metals. No problem. Black teeth were actually fashionable during parts of the Tudor period, as they signalled you could afford sugar, a luxury import. Queen Elizabeth herself had teeth so blackened from sugar that foreign ambassadors reported they could barely understand her speech. And don't forget the final touch, pomanders and perfumes to mask your body odour. Because bathing was considered dangerous, as opening your pores might let in disease. Most people bathed rarely, perhaps a few times a year at most, instead relying on regularly changing their linen undergarments to stay clean. So, there you have it, Tudor women's fashion. Beautiful, elaborate, and slowly killing you through constriction, chemical poisoning, and fire hazards. But at least you looked good for your husband, which is really all that matters in Tudor England, isn't it? Let's discuss the cornerstone of a Tudor woman's existence: marriage. It wasn't just a relationship, it was a business transaction, a political alliance, and your entire economic survival plan rolled into one. First, let's clear up a misconception, that romantic notion of marrying for love. File that under things that almost never happened in Tudor England. Marriage was an economic and social contract between families. The bride herself was essentially a commodity, being transferred from father to husband, bringing strategic advantages like land, money, or social connections. For common folk, marriages were slightly less calculated, but still primarily practical arrangements. You needed a partner with complementary skills to survive. A tanner needed a wife who could help with the lighter aspects of the trade while managing the household. A farmer needed someone who could handle the dairy and poultry while bearing children to provide future labour. Your consent to marriage was technically required by church law, but consent had a rather flexible definition. Family pressure, limited options, and the stark reality that an unmarried woman had few paths to economic survival meant your yes was often your only viable option. The marriage age was horrifying by modern standards. While most common women married in their mid to late teens, noble girls could be betrothed as young as 2 or 3 years old and married off as soon as they hit puberty. Margaret Beaufort, Henry VII's mother, was married at 12 and gave birth to the future king at 13, a traumatic delivery that damaged her body so severely she never bore another child. Once married, you legally ceased to exist as an independent entity. Under the doctrine of coverture, your legal identity was absorbed into your husband's. You couldn't own property independently, sign contracts, keep your own wages, or make legal decisions. Your husband controlled everything you owned, including inheritances or gifts specifically given to you. Your body wasn't your own either. Sexual submission was your marital duty, refusing your husband's advances. That was grounds for church intervention. Rape within marriage wasn't a concept the Tudors recognized. Your consent was implied by your marriage vows, and you'd better produce children quickly, preferably sons, or your value as a wife would be questioned. Domestic violence was not just tolerated, but expected as a form of necessary correction. A husband had the legal right to beat his wife moderately to maintain household discipline. The popular rule of thumb allegedly originated from the acceptable width of a stick a man could use to beat his wife, thin enough not to cause permanent damage. How considerate. Divorce as we know it didn't exist. You could seek an annulment if you could prove the marriage was invalid from the start. Impotence, close blood relation, or pre-contract, prior engagement were valid grounds. But this was extremely rare, and usually available only to the wealthy and powerful. Just ask Henry VIII how complicated it was, and he was the king. A more common escape was separation from bed and board, granted by ecclesiastical courts. But this didn't allow remarriage, and often left women destitute. Most women simply endured unhappy marriages because the alternatives were worse. Death was the most reliable way out of a bad marriage. And with disease, childbirth complications, and workplace hazards, it wasn't an uncommon exit. Widowhood, ironically, was one of the few states in which a Tudor woman gained some legal autonomy, able to own property and run businesses independently. Some widows enjoyed their newfound freedom so much they refused to remarry despite social pressure. But for many, economic necessity forced them back into the marriage market quickly. A widow with property was a hot commodity, and the cycle would begin again. So there you have it, Tudor marriage, where your husband was your lord, your body was his property, and your best hope for independence was his timely death. Not exactly the fairy tale, till death do us part, that modern brides envision. If marriage was a woman's duty, childbirth was her destiny, and potentially her death sentence. In Tudor England, creating new life often meant risking your own, transforming what should be joyful into something closer to Russian roulette with your reproductive organs. Your pregnancy journey begins with zero prenatal care. No ultrasounds, no fetal monitoring, not even a basic understanding of embryonic development. The Tudor explanation for pregnancy was based on the ancient Greek theory of humours, bodily fluids that needed to be in balance. Your growing belly was seen as an excess of blood that couldn't be expelled through menstruation. During pregnancy, you'd follow bizarre dietary restriction and old wives' tales. Cravings were believed to be the baby communicating its needs, and failing to satisfy them might result in birthmarks. Looking at a rabbit might give your child a hair lip. Reaching above your head could strangle the baby with its umbilical cord. Science wasn't exactly advanced. As your due date approached, you'd enter confinement, withdrawing from public life to prepare for birth. If you were wealthy, this meant a lavishly decorated birthing chamber with the windows sealed. Fresh air was considered dangerous, and every crack stuffed with cloth to create a womb-like darkness. If you were common, you simply continued working until contractions made it impossible. When labour began, your fate rested in the hands of midwives, women whose knowledge was passed down through generations rather than formal medical training. Some were skilled and experienced, others not so much. No male doctors attended births unless things went catastrophically wrong. The female reproductive system was considered too mysterious and shameful for male eyes. The birthing room was women-only territory. Your female relatives, neighbours, and the midwife would surround you, offering encouragement, herbal remedies, and prayers. Men, including your husband, waited elsewhere, probably drinking to calm their nerves or celebrating prematurely. Pain management. Hope you like chanting and herbal teas, because that's about it. No epidurals, no nitrous oxide, not even reliable opium preparations. You'd be offered various folk remedies. Eagle stones, tied to your thigh, rose water to sip, or a piece of jasper to clutch. For particularly difficult labours, you might be given a groaning malt, strong ale to take the edge off. Some women bit on sticks or leather straps to avoid screaming, which was thought to waste energy needed for pushing. Childbirth tools were rudimentary and terrifying. If things went wrong, the midwife might reach for iron hooks or crochets designed to extract a baby, often already dead, piece by piece. Caesarean sections existed, but were performed only when the mother was dead or dying, as a last-ditch effort to save the child for baptism. Surviving such emergency surgery was virtually unheard of. The statistics were grim. somewhere between 1 to 4% of births ended with the mother's death, figures that rose dramatically during times of famine or disease. Considering most women went through this gauntlet 6 to 10 times during their reproductive years, the cumulative risk was substantial. By some estimates, 20% of women died from pregnancy or childbirth-related causes during their lifetime. Common killers included hemorrhage, infection, puerperal fever, or childbed fever, eclampsia, obstructed labor, and retained placenta. Without antibiotics, sterile conditions, or blood transfusions, complications that would be manageable today were often fatal. Even if you survived the birth, infection in the following days could still claim you. If you made it through alive, there was no recovery period. Common women were expected to be back to full household duties within days. Queen Elizabeth of York, Henry VIII's mother, attended her daughter's christening just 3 days after giving birth, then died 9 days later from postpartum complications. Your newborn's survival was equally precarious. Infant mortality hovered around 30% in the first year of life. Many women experienced the heartbreak of losing multiple children. Those who survived might be handed off to wet nurses if you were wealthy, or strapped to your body as you returned to work if you weren't. And the cycle would begin again almost immediately. Without effective contraception, you could become pregnant again within weeks of giving birth. Many women were perpetually pregnant or nursing for 20 years of their adult lives, their bodies never fully recovering between pregnancies. No wonder many Tudor women approached childbirth with a mixture of religious fatalism and practical preparation. Many wrote wills before giving birth and made arrangements for their children in case they didn't survive. Childbirth wasn't just another life event. It was a near-death experience that every woman was expected to endure repeatedly. So, the next time you see a Tudor family portrait with a dozen children standing in a row, remember the woman who risked death to bring each one into the world, and the unknown number who didn't survive to be painted. If you're a woman in Tudor England hoping to expand your mind beyond recipes and Bible verses, I have some bad news for you. Your educational opportunities are about as limited as your legal rights, which is to say, practically non-existent for most. Let's start with the basics. Literacy. If you're a common woman, there's a good chance you can't read at all. Education for common folk was spotty at best, and what little existed was primarily reserved for boys. You might learn basic household arithmetic, enough to manage supplies and not get cheated at the market. But formal reading instruction? Unlikely. Even if your family could afford to send a child to a local parish school, they'd probably choose your brother. After all, he's the one who might need to sign contracts or read legal documents someday. You just need to recognize herbs and count eggs, right? If you're the daughter of a merchant or yeoman farmer, your prospects improve slightly. You might receive some rudimentary education, enough to read prayer books, write simple letters, and assist with the family business. However, this education would still be heavily focused on preparing you for your ultimate destiny, managing a household. For the tiny percentage of women born into nobility, education could be more substantial, but with a catch. Your learning wasn't meant to nurture your intellect or prepare you for independence. It was to make you a more valuable marriage prospect and a better reflection of your family's status. A noble girl's education typically included reading, writing, basic arithmetic, music, dancing, embroidery, household management, and possibly languages like French or Latin. This sounds reasonably comprehensive until you realize it was designed to make you decorative and useful rather than intellectually fulfilled. You'd learn to play the lute, not to express artistic passion, but to entertain guests in your future husband's home. You'd study languages, not for scholarly pursuits, but to converse politely with foreign diplomats. You'd master embroidery, not as creative expression, but to demonstrate the patience and precision expected of a well-bred wife. The rare Tudor woman who developed a true scholarly appetite faced significant barriers. Universities were exclusively male domains. Advanced texts in subjects like science, philosophy, or medicine were written in Latin, which most women weren't taught thoroughly. Access to books was limited by their expense and your family's willingness to indulge your unusual interest. Even the most educated Tudor women typically studied at home with tutors, rather than in schools or universities. This private education meant their learning depended entirely on their family's resources and attitudes. If your father was unusually progressive, like Sir Thomas More, who educated his daughters alongside his son, you might receive an exceptional education. If not, you were at the mercy of conventional wisdom, which held that too much learning made women argumentative and unsuitable as wives. Religion complicated matters further. The Tudor period spanned the English Reformation, bringing dramatic shifts in educational philosophy. Before the break with Rome, convent schools provided one of the few pathways for girls to receive formal education. When Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, these opportunities vanished overnight. Protestant reformers did promote literacy for both sexes. Everyone should be able to read the Bible after all, but with different expectations. Boys were educated for public life and professions. Girls were educated primarily for domestic piety. The double standard was glaring. A man who studied was scholarly. A woman who studied was neglecting her proper duties. A few exceptional women managed to become genuinely learned. Lady Jane Grey was renowned for her mastery of languages. Catherine Parr wrote religious texts. And Elizabeth was fluent in multiple languages. But they were remarkable exceptions, not the rule. For most Tudor women, education was like a decorative border on a garment. Pretty enough, but kept deliberately narrow and always secondary to the main fabric of their lives: marriage, children, and household management. So, if you found yourself in Tudor England with a hungry mind and curiosity about the universe, you'd better hope you were born into extreme privilege. And even then, prepare to fight against the prevailing belief that the greatest accomplishment your brain could achieve was remembering the correct spices for marchpane. If there's one thing that defined Tudor England beyond its monarchs, it was religious upheaval. And guess who bore the brunt of these spiritual whiplashings? Women, of course. You thought navigating modern religious discussions was tricky. Try doing it when the wrong prayer could get you burned at the stake. When the Tudor period began under Henry VIII, England was firmly Catholic. As a woman, your religious life was rigidly prescribed but relatively stable. You attended Mass regularly, confessed your sins to a priest, prayed to saints for intercession, and observed numerous holy days throughout the year. Then along came Henry VIII with his little marital problem. When the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry decided to become his own pope. The break with Rome in the 1530s set off religious changes that would swing back and forth like a pendulum for decades, with women often caught in the middle. Under Catholicism, you at least had female religious figures to identify with. The Virgin Mary provided a powerful female archetype, and female saints offered examples of women's spiritual power. Convents, while restrictive, provided one of the few spaces where women could exercise some authority and pursue education. The Protestant Reformation eliminated much of this. Mary's importance was diminished, saints were rejected as idolatrous, and convents were dissolved, forcing nuns to either marry or face destitution. One of the few institutional spaces where women held authority simply vanished. Protestant theology did offer some benefits for women. The emphasis on personal Bible reading in English rather than Latin made spiritual knowledge more accessible. The priesthood of all believers concept theoretically gave women's faith equal value to men's. The elevation of marriage over celibacy actually improved the status of wives somewhat, but in practice, new restrictions emerged to replace the old ones. If Catholicism had controlled women through confession and penance, Protestantism controlled them through intensely patriarchal family structures. The husband became the spiritual head of the household, responsible for his wife's religious instruction and moral behavior. The theological shifts were just part of the chaos. The real danger came from trying to navigate rapidly changing religious laws. Under Henry VIII, you could be executed for being too Catholic. Under his daughter, Mary I, you could be burned for being too Protestant. Under Elizabeth I, you needed to be publicly Anglican, while your private beliefs remained your own risky business. Imagine trying to keep your family safe during these swings. The prayer book you taught your children from last year could now be evidence of heresy. The saints you named your daughters after were now considered superstitious nonsense, or vice versa. Religious adaptability wasn't just spiritually confusing, it was a survival skill. Women faced unique religious persecution too. The witch hunts that would intensify after the Tudor period were already beginning, disproportionately targeting older women, widows, healers, and those who somehow defied social norms. Religious uncertainty created perfect conditions for scapegoating, and women made convenient targets. Tudor women also carried the spiritual burden of their gender's inherent sinfulness. Eve's original sin was used to justify women's subordination in both Catholic and Protestant teachings. Sermons regularly reminded women of their moral weakness and need for male guidance. Religious texts encouraging wifely submission were read at your wedding, taught to you as a girl, and repeated throughout your life. The good Tudor woman was expected to be devoutly religious, but never too opinionated about her faith. Spiritual enthusiasm in women was suspicious. It could look like seeking authority beyond your station. Female religious writers like Anne Askew were tortured and executed for promoting their views too boldly. Yet, despite these constraints, religion also offered Tudor women one of their few sources of power and expression. Through religious patronage, charitable works, and domestic religious instruction, some women carved out spheres of influence that would otherwise have been denied them. Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's sixth wife, wrote religious texts. Lady Margaret Beaufort, Henry VII's mother, was a significant religious patron. Countless unknown women maintained religious practices in their homes, preserving traditions or embracing new ones according to their convictions. So while Tudor religion was dangerous, shifting ground for women, it was also sometimes the only soil in which they could plant their own authority. When almost every other avenue for expression was closed, faith remained one realm where a woman's inner life was her own, even if expressing it too publicly could still get her killed. Think modern beauty standards are tough. The Tudors would like a word. Beauty in Tudor England wasn't just about looking good. It was a moral imperative, a status symbol, and sometimes a slow-acting poison, all wrapped into one pale, lead-covered package. The ideal Tudor beauty had skin as white as snow, cheeks as red as blood, and hair as yellow as gold. Basically, Snow White with blonde highlights. This wasn't just aesthetic preference. It was deeply rooted in class distinction. Pale skin signified a life of leisure indoors, away from manual labour in the sun. The whiter you appeared, the higher your social status. To achieve this coveted pallor, women applied ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar, to their faces, necks, and décolletage. Yes, actual lead, the same toxic metal we now carefully remove from paint and gasoline. Tudor women were smearing it directly onto their largest organ. This potent poison would be absorbed through the skin, causing headaches, nausea, abdominal pain, and eventually more serious conditions, like kidney failure, neurological damage, and infertility. But the beautiful corpse look wouldn't be complete without those blood-red cheeks and lips. For this, women turned to vermilion, mercuric sulfide, or red ochre, iron oxide, mixed with beeswax. Mercury poisoning added tremors, psychosis, and drooling to the lead poisoning symptoms you were already enjoying. What price beauty? Hair presented its own challenges. That coveted golden blonde shade could be achieved through a concoction of sulfur, alum, honey, and lye applied to the hair and left to bake in the sun. The process was smelly, caustic to the scalp, and often resulted in hair damage or loss. But at least you could temporarily achieve that Elizabeth Warrens-esque golden glow. If you weren't naturally blessed with a high forehead, another beauty standard of the time, you might pluck your hairline back several inches. This practice, popular among the nobility, often resulted in permanent hair loss over time. But looking like you had a giant brain was apparently worth the sacrifice. Eyebrows? Barely there. The fashion was for very faint, thin brows, the opposite of today's bold look. Some women even used bandages soaked in vinegar and cat dung to remove unwanted hair. The resulting infections were just a bonus, I suppose. Teeth were a particular challenge in an era without dentistry. Tooth blackening from sugar consumption became so common among the wealthy that it was occasionally considered fashionable, a bizarre, if you can't beat it, embrace it approach to dental decay. Elizabeth I's teeth were reportedly so black and decayed that foreign ambassadors struggled to understand her speech. For those aiming to keep their teeth either white or at least in their mouths, popular tooth powders contained everything from crushed cuttlefish bones to brick dust. The bathing situation didn't help matters. Full body bathing was rare, considered by many to be dangerous to health, as it supposedly opened the pores to disease. Most people made do with spot cleaning of visible areas, relying on frequent changes of linen undergarments to absorb body oils and sweat. The resulting body odour was masked with heavy perfumes, pomanders, scented balls carried or worn, and herb-scented clothing. What makes Tudor beauty standards particularly insidious is that they weren't just about fashion, they were moral.
Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to a journey back in time, to an era where chivalry was occasionally a thing, hygiene was definitely not, and Netflix and chill involved a suspicious amount of straw. Tonight, we're diving into a subject both scandalous and scholarly, the intimate, confusing, and occasionally downright bizarre world of medieval sex. It was an era of deeply suspicious herbal remedies, questionable medical advice, and a time when foreplay often meant asking politely and fervently, hoping no one was watching, especially the goat. So, before you get comfortable, or maybe uncomfortable depending on where this script takes us, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No forced affection, please. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Are you enjoying your morning coffee, a midday snack, or perhaps a midnight snack of mystery meat? It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft medieval musk-masking hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Don't worry, we'll keep it mostly historically accurate and definitely hilarious. The lack of personal space, a medieval bedroom farce. Let's start with the biggest, most hilarious misconception. Medieval intimacy did not unfold beneath silk sheets in candlelit chambers, while a lute played softly in the background. Oh no, my friends. In reality, the setting was usually a small, single-room home, shared by an entire family. We're talking children, aging relatives, a couple of goats, and at least one very opinionated chicken who had strong feelings about personal space. Privacy, as we think of it today, simply didn't exist. Most peasants lived in homes where the kitchen, bedroom, and stable were technically the same square footage, just with different and often competing smells. If a couple wanted some alone time, they had to get creative. Timing mattered. So did volume. And, ideally, so did whether the kids were sound asleep and facing the wall, perhaps dreaming of turnips. Curtains were a luxury reserved for, well, probably the Lord's prize pig. Beds were shared, often by multiple people, and even among the upper classes, servants might be asleep at the foot of the bed, or standing in the corner, expertly pretending not to notice anything. Many noble households even kept meticulous records of bedroom arrangements for legal or religious reasons, which is exactly as awkward as it sounds. Yes, my lord, the Duke of Grime and the Countess of Mildew shared the straw mattress by the fireplace on the night of the full moon. Travelling also didn't help. Inns often had shared beds. That's right, total strangers might sleep side by side for the night, which made things even more complicated. Want a little affection? You better check if there's already someone in the bed, and whether or not they brought their muddy boots. If you were married and both parties were still awake and reasonably clean, a big if for the era, you could share a mattress of straw and hope for the best. If you weren't married, well, you had to be twice as quiet and 3 times as careful. Communities were small, walls were thin or non-existent, and gossip travelled faster than plague rats. For those living in monasteries or convents, the rule was simple. No, no, no. No privacy, no distractions, and certainly no late-night whispers. But even there, human nature occasionally made things complicated, which explains why many abbeys had unusually high garden walls. Just saying. The Church's opinion, more rules than a modern tax code. In the medieval world, few things shaped private life more than the Church, and it had a lot to say about what went on behind closed doors, or, more accurately, behind shared curtains. According to Church teachings, physical intimacy had one primary function: making more people. That was it. Not pleasure, not bonding, not stress relief, just reproduction. Everything else was at best a distraction, and at worst, a capital S sin. This wasn't just Sunday sermon material. Bishops, theologians, and confessors wrote detailed instructions on what was and wasn't acceptable, just in case anyone dared to improvise. Certain days of the week were off limits. So were major feast days, fasting days, holy days, and in some regions, entire liturgical seasons. Want to be close to your spouse during Lent? Think again. Advent? Also number. That left maybe Tuesdays in April, if the stars aligned and the chickens were quiet. Even within marriage, there were expectations. Couples were encouraged to approach one another with modesty and restraint. Expressions of affection were acceptable, but excessive displays of passion were, to put it mildly, frowned upon. One 13th century guide suggested that married couples should engage in intimacy without pleasure, without sin, and without delay, which is, by all accounts, a fairly joyless checklist. The preferred method was missionary, and not just for religious symbolism. It was deemed the most natural, and therefore the least likely to offend God, the saints, or your local priest. Anything else was considered suspect, including, apparently, enthusiasm. Confession also got involved. Priests often asked pointed questions during confession to determine whether couples had broken any moral or ecclesiastical guidelines. These weren't vague spiritual inquiries. They were very specific, sometimes uncomfortably so. Let's just say the average 14th century friar knew far more about his parishioners' bedrooms than their birthdays. Still, enforcement was uneven. Some regions were stricter than others. Some priests ignored these rules entirely, and many lay people, particularly peasants, simply smiled, nodded, and did what they were going to do anyway, very, very quietly. If you think modern couples have trouble syncing their schedules, spare a thought for medieval folks planning a romantic evening. It required a calendar, a priest's blessing, and the luck of saint. Valentine himself, who ironically was never married. Medieval calendar of love when not to get too cozy. The church had opinions, and by opinions we mean strict prohibitions, on when intimacy was allowed. Sundays? Absolutely not. That was the Lord's Day, for praying, not playing. Fridays? Still no. Day of penance. Wednesdays? Suspicious. Add in Lent, 40 days. Advent, another 40. Various saints' feast days, holy days, fast days, and even certain moon phases, and you'll find the calendar was less of a schedule and more of a divine obstacle course. The idea was to keep the soul focused on heaven, even when the body had other ideas. There were even lists, actual lists, of forbidden days. Some confession manuals outline nearly half the year as off-limits, and if you were feeling particularly affectionate during one of those forbidden days, well, enjoy your spiritual guilt and an extra trip to confession. One 13th century bishop famously scolded a married couple for their excessive affection, which, according to his notes, translated to more than once a month. He recommended they redirect their passion toward prayer. The couple was reportedly not thrilled. Naturally, the upper classes were more exposed to these restrictions. They had chaplains, confessors, and spiritual advisors breathing down their necks, often literally. Peasants, meanwhile, had a more flexible approach. Their lives revolved around livestock, unpredictable weather, and the ever-present concern of not freezing to death, which left less time for worrying about whether Tuesday was the feast of Saint Nun. To make things worse, some believed that intimacy during the wrong time could result in sickly children, divine punishment, or, worst of all, a ruined reputation if your neighbours caught wind that you were celebrating a little too enthusiastically during Lent. It could lead to shame, relentless gossip, or a strongly worded sermon delivered with maximum eye contact from the pulpit. Awkward. Love and Marriage, medieval edition. Less romance, more real estate. Romance in medieval Europe was less about falling in love and more about falling into a legally binding agreement. If you were hoping for candlelit dinners, passionate poetry, and whispered confessions, you'd be better off reading a troubadour ballad. Real-life courtship for most people involved livestock, land rights, and two families simply agreeing not to start a feud. Marriage was primarily a business deal. Daughters were exchanged to cement alliances, acquire property, or secure peace between neighbours who had previously disagreed over whose pig ate whose cabbage. A bride might come with a dowry of coin, linens, or a small patch of farmland. In return, the groom's family might promise not to be entirely insufferable. Courtship, when it happened, was meticulously supervised, sometimes literally. Young people rarely caught a moment alone. A maiden might be watched over by her mother, a stern aunt, or, if things got really serious, an entire village that was very invested in whether or not you merely held hands. Among the nobility, arranged matches were the absolute norm. Kings and lords negotiated marriages like chess moves, and affection was something you developed later, or not at all. As one medieval proverb more or less stated, better a wealthy match with a grumpy face than a poor one with dimples. Romantic. Even among peasants, practical concerns ruled. A man's suitability was judged by his land, his tools, or the impressive size of his ox. And women? They were evaluated on their housekeeping skills, their reputation, spotless preferably, and their general ability to not start drama at the market. This doesn't mean love didn't exist. It did, but it usually came after marriage, not before. If affection grew over time, that was considered a bonus, not a requirement. Think of it like medieval emotional DLC. Definitely not included in the base marriage package. Still, where there's a will, there's a workaround. Secret flirtations, playful songs, and moonlit walks to the village well became the unsanctioned side quests of medieval dating. Just be careful, get caught kissing behind the barn, and you could face public penance, a hefty fine, or a very disappointed father wielding a pitchfork. The myth of the chastity belt, more fashion statement than function. Let's clear up one of the most persistent and frankly ridiculous legends about medieval relationships: chastity belts. Yes, you've probably seen them in cartoons, historical dramas, or very unfortunate museum gift shops. Those iron contraptions allegedly locked around a woman's waist while her husband went off to war, leaving her physically and morally sealed. Except, not really. There's no solid historical evidence that chastity belts were ever widely used in the Middle Ages. In fact, most examples we have today come from the Renaissance or even the Victorian era, periods far more obsessed with the idea of medieval repression than with what actually happened. Many of these belts were created as joke items, cautionary warnings, or clever museum curiosities, not functioning devices. Medieval manuscripts, which often record all sorts of uncomfortable and minute details, are suspiciously silent about mass belt distribution. No tailor advertised them, no laws regulated them, no churches handed them out during awkward marriage ceremonies. It's almost as if, and stay with me here, they weren't actually a thing. Which makes perfect sense because the design is wildly impractical. Medieval hygiene was already questionable. Now imagine adding a rusty metal contraption with no user manual, and a padlock that probably required a blacksmith. It would have caused more infections than it prevented indiscretions. So where did the myth come from? Likely from a combination of later moral panic and satire. Renaissance moralists and Victorian collectors simply loved the image of a repressed, over-controlled medieval woman. It fit their narrative perfectly, and nothing says virtue like a literal keyhole in your underpants. In reality, fidelity was enforced through more traditional, and frankly more effective means: shame, surveillance, religion, and strategic matchmaking. Noble women were often chaperoned within an inch of their lives. Peasant girls had entire villages watching them like unpaid private investigators. And any whiff of scandal could lead to ruined reputations, lost dowries, or awkward confessions involving phrases like, "at the edge of the barley field, father." Brothels and bishops, a very medieval arrangement. In a surprising twist that would shock many of their modern descendants, medieval towns didn't just tolerate brothels, in many cases they regulated them. That's right, in several parts of medieval Europe, especially urban centres, brothels operated as perfectly legal businesses. Town councils licensed them, charged taxes, and even designated specific red light districts, long before the light bulb was invented. Some cities went as far as employing officials to manage them. These lucky souls were known as brothel keepers, or more colourfully, keepers of public women, which sounds like a very stressful line on a resume. The rationale behind this arrangement was pragmatic, if a little cynical. Officials believed that allowing a controlled outlet for men's desires would reduce the chances of greater sins like adultery, assault, or, heaven forbid, dancing. Regulated brothels were seen as a necessary evil to keep society orderly, much like traffic signs or the unfortunate existence of turnips. The church, of course, wasn't thrilled. Officially it condemned the entire practice, but unofficially many clergy turned a blind eye. Some even reportedly collected rent from the very same establishments. If that sounds like hypocrisy, congratulations. You've just grasped the essence of medieval theology and practice. Working in a brothel was no fairy tale, but it wasn't necessarily a life of constant misery either. Some women chose the profession for economic reasons, especially widows or those without family support. Others were coerced or trafficked, particularly in bustling port cities where sailors brought in coin and complications in equal measure. There were even handbooks, yes, actual handbooks, for how these houses should be managed. Clean sheets, basic health inspections, and set hours were all part of the regulation process. Patrons came from all social classes, knights, apprentices, merchants, even monks, despite vows that strongly suggested otherwise. Entry fees varied, services were catalogued, and in some cases customers paid in eggs, wool, or whatever awkward barter they had on hand. Medieval tinder it was not. Medieval hygiene, a scent sessional adventure. Let's set the scene. Candlelight flickering, a soft breeze through the thatched roof, your beloved whispers sweet nothings, and then removes their wool tunic to reveal a powerful medieval musk. Because when it came to personal hygiene, medieval Europe had priorities. Staying clean was on the list, just somewhere after surviving the plague, fixing the roof and catching the pig that got into the pantry again. Bathing did happen, but not nearly as often as modern noses would hope. Peasants bathed infrequently, maybe once a month, more if they fell into a river by accident. Soap was either homemade or imported, expensive and used sparingly. And while public bathhouses existed in towns and cities, they were sometimes banned during outbreaks of disease or scandal, or both. If you were wealthy, you had options. A hot bath could be drawn, scented with herbs, and followed by being rubbed with linen cloths by attendants. If you were poor, your sponge bath involved a cold bucket, and the vague hope that nobody would notice your aroma over the stables. To add complexity, water itself was occasionally viewed with suspicion, especially cold water. Some believed bathing too frequently could weaken the body or open the skin to illness. Others simply didn't have the time, or the tub, or any water that wasn't already being fought over by the local geese. Now imagine trying to impress someone under these conditions. Perfume, mostly for the elite. Deodorant? A dream of the distant future. Dental care? Well, you might rub your teeth with ash or chew mint leaves if you were fancy. Kissing was certainly an adventure. Clothing didn't help. Layers of wool, leather, linen and fur trapped heat, sweat and every scent you encountered during your day, including the contents of the chamber pot and the mystery stew. And yet, people still found ways to fall in love, flirt and get close. Perhaps our standards were different, or perhaps when everyone smelled equally awful, love was truly blind and nose blind. Medieval birth control, more prayer than precision. In medieval Europe, controlling the size of your family was a bit like trying to steer a cart with no wheels, no reins, and a particularly uncooperative goat. Technically possible, but not something you could count on. To be clear, people did try. Just because contraception wasn't effective by modern standards didn't mean medieval folks were oblivious. They were very much aware that certain behaviours led to babies, and many went to elaborate, if occasionally baffling, lengths to prevent it. Some of the more scientific methods included herbal mixtures, animal membranes, let's not ask, and rituals that involved burying certain objects near the doorstep. One popular approach advised drinking wine boiled with beaver testicles. Others recommended wearing amulets blessed by someone who hopefully wasn't guessing. A few guides even claimed jumping up and down vigorously after intimacy would help, which, if nothing else, probably burned some calories. There were also early versions of barrier methods, though calling them reliable would be generous. Linen soaked in various concoctions was one approach. A few brave souls tried wax. And there are scattered references to, let's call them, medieval prototypes of what would later become familiar latex devices. But don't ask how they were made. You really don't want to know. The church, of course, was not amused. Any attempt to avoid conception was often labelled sinful or unnatural. Procreation was the stated goal of marriage, and anything that got in the way of that divine mission was frowned upon, or, more commonly, denounced loudly from the pulpit. Still, not everyone followed church guidance. Among married couples, particularly those struggling with poverty, the desire to space out pregnancies or avoid another mouth to feed was very real. and among unmarried couples, let's just say the motivation was even stronger. But no matter the method, reliability was low. Birth control, such as it was, depended on folk wisdom, local herbs, and a surprising amount of hope, and when it failed, which it often did, well, that's where hasty marriages, hidden pregnancies, and a lot of awkward conversations came in. Medieval flirting, getting ahead of yourself, and the law. Despite what church authorities like to pretend, not every medieval couple waited until the wedding bells rang before getting cozy. In fact, the practice of testing the goods before marriage was, well, common enough to require a lot of paperwork. Known as fornication in church records and getting ahead of yourself in everyday village gossip, intimacy before marriage wasn't exactly rare, but it was definitely monitored. In towns and parishes across Europe, local officials kept moral rolls, which were less like private diaries and more like public ledgers of shame. If a couple was caught, or even suspected of jumping the marital timeline, they could be hauled before the local court and fined. Sometimes the fine went to the church, sometimes to the town, and occasionally to someone who claimed to have witnessed the event. Medieval snitching was alive and well. Fines varied depending on whether it was a first offence, whether a pregnancy resulted, or whether the couple eventually got married. In some cases, getting married after the fact erased the fine, kind of like retroactive permission. In others, the fine was still applied, but at a discounted rate. Early bird penalties, if you will. And let's not forget the social consequences. In tight-knit communities, everyone knew everyone else's business. So even if your local priest was feeling merciful, your neighbours weren't. Gossip could spread faster than a poorly stored meat pie in July. Interestingly, many of these situations resulted in something called handfasting, a sort of informal engagement, where the couple considered themselves betrothed, and in some regions, that was legally enough to begin cohabiting. The church later tried to tighten that loophole, but in the meantime, a lot of medieval babies were technically early arrivals. Among peasants, this was all handled with a bit more practicality. If a couple was clearly serious and a pregnancy had occurred, marriage usually followed, sometimes hurried along with a gentle nudge or firm push from both families. Among nobles, however, consequences could be far worse, especially if inheritance or reputation was on the line. Virginity, a contract, a tool, an obsession. In the medieval world, virginity wasn't just a virtue, it was a contract clause, a political tool, and occasionally a community-wide obsession. Among the peasantry, expectations varied by region and circumstance. A young woman was generally expected to arrive at marriage untested, at least officially. But if she didn't, well, some eyebrows would rise, and a small fine or shotgun wedding might sort things out. For the upper classes, though, things got serious. Noble women's virginity was directly tied to inheritance, alliances, and family honour. A broken engagement might spark a feud. A pregnancy out of wedlock could derail generations of meticulous planning. So how did they verify it? Well, badly. Sometimes it came down to vague testimony and character references. She seemed virtuous, or at least she avoided the stable boy mostly. Other times, more invasive methods were used, like midwives or matrons inspecting for the infamous hymen, which science has since confirmed is not, in fact, a medieval chastity barometer. But that didn't stop anyone. There were also attempts to prove virginity after the wedding, such as displaying a blood-stained sheet like a very awkward medieval Yelp review. This tradition, while not universal, was expected in certain regions, and if the sheet stayed clean. Q lawsuits, annulments, and family drama on a scale rivaling a royal soap opera. Men, of course, were under no such scrutiny. Male virginity was considered an optional bonus, like extra croutons on your soup. A future husband's experience level was rarely questioned. At most, he might be encouraged to avoid tavern maids or loose company, but no one was checking his laundry the next morning. Virginity was also linked to religious symbolism. Maidens were often praised as pure vessels, which is beautiful in theory, and incredibly uncomfortable in practice. Young girls were raised with saintly ideals, often featuring horrifying martyrdom stories. And if a marriage was annulled on the grounds that a bride had been dishonest, it didn't just ruin her, it could drag down her entire family's honour and property claims. So yes, in medieval Europe, Virginity wasn't just about morality, it was legal currency. Same-sex attraction, humans will be humans, quietly. If you're wondering whether same-sex attraction existed in medieval times, the answer is a resounding yes. Human nature didn't just start in the 20th century, you know. But if you're wondering whether it was openly accepted, that's where things get complicated. Medieval society was structured around rigid religious doctrine, strict social roles and property rights, and all three had a lot to say about who could love whom. Spoiler alert, it was usually a man and a woman within marriage, preferably for the sole purpose of making more villagers. Officially, same-sex intimacy was labelled a sin by the church, often lumped in with other unnatural acts like dancing on feast days or reading too many books. Punishments varied wildly depending on region, time period, and who was involved. A peasant couple might get a stern scolding and some penance. Nobles? They might face exile, or more commonly, quietly be ignored if they had enough land and influence. But while the church thundered from the pulpit, real life was messier. We have records, poems, letters, and even legal documents that show emotional, romantic, and sometimes physical relationships between people of the same sex. Some monks wrote love letters to each other in Latin that sound suspiciously less brotherly and more longing. Noble women sometimes shared beds and declared exclusive devotion in terms that would make a troubadour blush. Medieval Europe also had social structures that blurred lines. All-male monasteries and all-female convents naturally created deep emotional bonds. Knightly brotherhoods were full of vows and affectionate language. Some historians debate whether these were romantic, platonic, or something delightfully in between. But either way, there were feelings involved, and possibly poetry. As for terminology, the modern concept of sexual identity didn't exist. You didn't come out, you just lived carefully, quietly, and often coded in allegory. There were no pride parades, but there were songs, saints' stories, and suspiciously intense pilgrimages taken in pairs. Adultery. A risky business, especially for women. Adultery in medieval Europe was a bit like handling a live chicken while juggling knives. Risky, loud, and likely to end with someone losing a bit of pride or property. Let's be clear, adultery wasn't just a personal failing, it was a serious social offence. Marriage was seen not only as a holy sacrament, but also a binding legal contract, a significant property deal, and often a strategic alliance between powerful families. So when someone strayed, they weren't just breaking hearts, they were tampering with inheritances, dowries, and the always fragile local gossip equilibrium. For women, the stakes were significantly higher. A married woman caught in an affair could face public shaming, loss of dowry rights, forced penance, or even exile, especially if she had the audacity to get caught with evidence. Adulterous noble women might find themselves imprisoned, divorced, or, in extreme cases, discreetly removed from court life. Think less scarlet letter, more scarlet exit. Men, on the other hand, generally got more leeway. A married man having an affair with an unmarried woman might be seen as morally suspect, but he wasn't usually legally punished, unless the woman's family had powerful friends or the church was feeling unusually righteous that week. That said, not all male adulterers got off easy. Some towns imposed steep fines or required public confession. A few legal records include creative punishments, such as parading through the village in nothing but a shift for either gender, or having to pay for a new church bell, because nothing says divine justice like bronze acoustics. The real danger, however, wasn't always the law, it was the husband. Honour killings weren't unheard of, particularly among nobles. If a cuckolded man discovered his wife's affair, medieval custom sometimes allowed him to take appropriate action. The definition of appropriate, of course, depended heavily on his status and how many swords he owned. For the wealthy, things could spiral into full-blown scandals, annulments, or decade-long family feuds. For peasants, the consequences were usually financial. A fine here, a goat forfeited there, and a permanent place in village gossip. Consent, a murky concept. In medieval Europe, the idea of consent existed, but not in the shiny, enthusiastic yes way we understand it today. Instead, it was tangled in dense law codes, valuable dowries, strict church doctrine, and the occasional shrug from society. Let's start with the basics. medieval canon law did recognise the concept of consent in marriage. In fact, a marriage was considered valid if both parties verbally consented, even without a priest present. That's right. Two people saying "I will" in a field somewhere could technically be married. Romantic? Possibly. Legally confusing? Absolutely. But here's the rub. Just because consent was acknowledged in theory doesn't mean it was respected in practice, especially for women. For noble daughters, consent often came after arrangements were made. Families negotiated marriages like peace treaties, drawing up elaborate contracts. The young lady's opinion might be politely requested or strongly implied, but in the end the dowry talked louder than she did. For peasant women, choices were broader but still pressured. Saying no to a match could mean economic ruin or social backlash. Saying no to the local reeve's son, risker still. Inside marriage, consent became even murkier. Husbands had legal rights to their wives' bodies, and denying them could be grounds for complaint or annulment. Some church thinkers even argued that spouses owed each other the marital debt, which sounds like a joint checking account, but was actually far less voluntary. Still, the picture wasn't all grim. Medieval courts did prosecute cases of coercion and assault, especially when witnesses were available or the accused didn't have powerful friends. In urban centres like London or Paris, court records show women and men bringing forward complaints, sometimes winning justice, or at least making a very public stink. And let's not forget the literary side. Medieval tales are full of complex dynamics. Courtly love poetry, for example, often danced around consent, with knights pining, ladies refusing, and everyone dramatically swooning. If nothing else, they knew it was important to ask, even if they sometimes ignored the answer. The church and pleasure, a rather suspicious relationship. If you ever felt like the medieval church had a complicated relationship with physical pleasure, you're absolutely right. It wasn't just complicated, it was borderline suspicious. And that suspicion extended right into the bedroom of every married couple, where the church preferred, ideally, that nothing too enjoyable was going on. To be fair, the church didn't outright ban marital relations. That would have been a logistical nightmare for inheritance, population, and, well, humanity. But it did strongly recommend moderation. Extreme moderation. Like, once a month, in the dark, no smiling kind of moderation. Theologians of the time praised celibacy as the highest form of spiritual discipline. Saints were celibate, monks and nuns took vows. Even married couples were encouraged to live incontinently, abstaining entirely, especially if they were older, holier, or simply tired of each other. A couple who voluntarily gave up intimacy was praised as being halfway to sainthood, or at least halfway to separate beds. Some church thinkers like St. Jerome went even further. He argued that even within marriage, desire was a weakness. Marital relations were acceptable only for procreation, not for fun, not for bonding, and certainly not because someone looked particularly fetching in their woolen nightshirt. This attitude filtered down into confessionals and moral manuals. Priests were instructed to ask married parishioners if they had been too lustful, even with their own spouses. Picture the awkward silence that must have followed that question at the altar rail, and yet people still lived their lives. Most peasants, merchants, and even nobles nodded politely at the church's teachings, then went home and did whatever felt right between chores, taxes, and the odd peasant uprising. Let's be honest, after a long day threshing barley or settling land disputes, a little affection probably felt more comforting than shameful, but for the truly devout, celibate marriages were held up as models of spiritual partnership. These were couples who lived together, prayed together, and considered carnal urges a thing of the past, or at least a thing better left to younger, less holy villagers. Did medieval people fall in love? Yes, surprisingly. After everything we've covered, arranged marriages, fines for flirting, herbal birth control, suspicious bath habits, and church warnings against smiling too much, you might be wondering, did medieval people actually fall in love? The answer is a resounding yes, awkwardly, passionately, and sometimes even happily. Despite the rigid social structures and moral sermons, love found a way to bloom in the cracks. Peasant couples courted in fields and marketplaces, trading favours, wildflowers, and whispered gossip over turnips. Noble lovers exchanged poetry and secret glances during formal banquets. while pretending to care about hunting falcon breeds. Monks and nuns wrote letters filled with emotion that modern readers still debate. Was it spiritual longing or something more? Literature from the period is bursting with romance. Troubadours sang of distant ladies who inspired knights to go off and get very dramatically injured. Stories of courtly love glorified longing from afar, especially if you were pining for someone married to your boss. Sure, the love was often unattainable, but hey, that's where the best verses come from. In some cases, couples genuinely married for love. Records survive of peasants who eloped or refused matches arranged by their parents. Even nobles occasionally rebelled, much to the horror of their family accountants. The church, interestingly enough, actually required verbal consent from both bride and groom, even if that consent was delivered through gritted teeth, while holding a goose as dowry collateral. And once married, many couples built strong partnerships. They worked side by side, raised children, endured plagues, and navigated taxes, which is basically the medieval version of a romantic getaway. Letters between spouses, especially during times of separation, show real affection, real longing, and real commitment. Even widows and widowers sometimes remarried for companionship rather than political gain, choosing someone they genuinely like to spend their remaining years with. Because even after everything, the rules, the risks, the rituals, people still wanted to feel loved. Preferably before curfew, and hopefully not during Lent.